Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 28th meeting of the Justice Committee. We have no apologies this morning, and our first item of business is to continue our consideration of the Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Bill. We will take evidence this morning from three different panels of witnesses. And our first panel comprises 7 witnesses, and I'd like to welcome them all and thank them very warmly for joining us this morning. We have with us in our first panel this morning Adam Stracura from Age Scotland, John Wilkes from the Equality and Human Rights Commission, Tim Hopkins from the Equality Network, Una Brown from the Scottish Commission for People with Learning Disabilities, Colin McFarlane from Stonewall, Kate Wallace from Victim Support Scotland, and Kevin Kane from YouthLink Scotland. Thank you all very much for giving up your time to help the committee with our inquiries this morning, and you're all very welcome. Now, because we've got such a large panel this morning, we're not going to be able to take opening remarks from you all. I'm going to launch straight in with the questions, if I may. It may be that you will all want to respond in turn to the questions, but if you don't have anything to add, please don't feel that you need to. And members will endeavour to address their questions to particular witnesses, at least to start with, so that we don't all speak at once and confuse the broadcasters on whom we are all relying, as usual, this morning. So can I start? And I'd like to direct this question first to Tim Hopkins from the Equality Network, and then after Tim, to John Wilkes from the Equality and Human Rights Commission, please. So can I ask this to start with? As you know, the expansion of hate crime contemplated by this bill has attracted widespread criticism on human rights grounds. And responding to that criticism, the Cabinet Secretary announced in September that he proposed to amend the bill. Could I ask for your reaction to the Cabinet Secretary's proposed amendments? Do you welcome them? Do you think they go far enough? Or indeed, do you think they go too far? And if I could address that question to Tim Hopkins first, that would be great. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much indeed, Convener. Thank you for inviting me to give evidence this morning. Yes, we do support the Cabinet Secretary's suggested amendments to the Stirring Up Hatred offence. For us, I should say part 1 of the bill is by far the more important part, but we do support the extension of Stirring Up Hatred to the other protected characteristics. To give you an example of the kind of thing I think it should cover, the Stirring Up Hatred on grounds of sexual orientation offence in England has been used to prosecute people 3 times in the last 10 years. One of those involved 3 men who distributed leaflets to houses in a locality. On one side of the leaflet, there was a cartoon of a gay man being hanged. And on the other side of the leaflet, it said, the only question about homosexuality in classical times was the method of execution to use. Now, those leaflets were clearly intended to stir up hatred, and they were threatening. And it's that kind of wrong that the Stirring Up Hatred offence is targeted at. I don't think we should assume with the rise of far-right activism, I don't think we should assume that it couldn't happen here in Scotland. Now, I think that cases like that, the court can infer from what's been happening that there's an intention there to stir up hatred. So I think the amendment by the Justice Secretary doesn't diminish the utility of the offence. I do think it's important that it covers both threatening or abusive behaviour, because if you consider the example I just mentioned, think about the kind of materials that were produced by the Nazis about Jewish people, with horrible, horribly abusive cartoons of Jewish people, clearly intended to stir up hatred, but not necessarily in themselves directly threatening. So we think it is important that that kind of behaviour would be caught by the offence as well. In terms of freedom of expression, we strongly support freedom of expression. We think that there is an issue with sections 11 and 12 of the bill, because they only cover 2 of the protected characteristics and they only cover certain behaviours. So we would prefer to see a freedom of expression provision in the bill that covers all of the protected characteristics and is more general in terms. In our supplementary written evidence, we made one suggestion for that, but I'm sure there are other possibilities as well.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. If I could ask the same question, please, to John Wilkes from the Equality and Human Rights Commission.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener. And can I also thank you for allowing us to come and give evidence this morning. Yes, broadly, we followed this debate with interest as the bill proposals were introduced. and the reactions to that from some sections. Both are, in terms of the issue about stirring up offences, we're supportive of the proposed amendments and consistency believe they should apply across all characteristics. We do acknowledge that racial hatred is the most commonly reported hate crime, and we note that there's no proposals to change that. And we discussed that quite a lot in some of our own publications about how you balance freedom of expression and stirring up. Happy to go into more details if that's helpful.
Thank you. Are there any other witnesses who disagree? Is anybody who wants to say that they don't support the Cabinet Secretary's amendments, that they are mistaken, or is this a unanimous view of all 7 of our witnesses that they wish to support these amendments? Rona, nobody's indicating that they disagree with that, so I won't pursue this line of questioning. So I'll hand the questioning over to you, and then after Rona, it'll be Liam MacArthur, please. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, convener. Good morning, panel. I'd like to ask about the different approach to race hate crime in the bill. I'd like my questions to be addressed to John Wilkes, Kate Wallace and Kevin Kane, and anyone that wants to add anything, just put an R in the chat box. So race hate constitutes 2/3 of all reported instances of hate crime. Clearly that's a huge issue. And unlike other proposals in the bill, insulting behaviour may be the basis of liability. It doesn't require intent to stir up racial hatred. And as we know, stirring up of racial hatred has been a crime in England and Wales since 1986. But there haven't been many prosecutions of stirring up racial hatred or possessing racially inflammatory material. So my questions are, should race crime be treated differently? Should we take a more robust approach to it, given the prevalence of it? And does it, in effect, create a hierarchy of characteristics being different from the other issues in the bill? Would John Wilkes like to start, please?
Thank you. Well, broadly, we agreed with Lord Brackadell's view that the existing provisions concerning stirring up of racial hatred should be revised so that they're formulated in the same way as other stirring up hatred offences. Wherever possible, helps to provide wider understanding of hate crime and how it is dealt with. And we were also persuaded by Lord Brackadell's evidence that deletion of the word insulting did not undermine the ability to bring prosecutions. However, we do acknowledge that racial hatred is one of the most commonly reported crimes in Scotland. So that's where we stand on the issue at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Kate Wallace? I'm not sure we're hearing or seeing Kate. Can we move on to Kevin Kane until that gets sorted out, please?
Hi.
Hi.
Can't see me. I trust everybody can see me, though.
Yes, I can see you.
Thank you. It's been mentioned that the provision on race has been in the statute books since 1986 and it's been rarely used, and that a thought process flows from that, which is, where's the issue? However, we're in the game of education, information provision, training, working with young people in community and education settings and taking an informal approach. So it's really important for us that any legislation is clear, one, for those who are impacted by the law, but also those who are in the game of education. It is difficult, and I read some of the previous responses, to envisage a scenario where words that are used that are not threatening or abusive that would result in criminalisation. So if it's not insulting and meets the threshold for threatening and abusive behaviour, then it renders insulting null and void anyway. And you'll notice from the our written response that we cautiously shared the Scottish Government's view that the threshold should be retained as threatening, abusive and insulting. However, in that same response, we also said that we understood Lord Brackadale's argument on the removal of insulting if it's about streamlining the legislation. Important also to say that streamlining doesn't mean like for like. So the main thing for us is that we need to continue to listen to the affected groups, PAME groups. The view from many of those groups within our youth work equality forums was that the removal of insulting would weaken the proposed legislation. So we do believe, and it's similar to the Justice Secretary, that we need to keep discussion going in this part of the bill and continue to listen to the views of that particular community. I do take the point about the potential for creating a hierarchy of protected characteristics. However, being mindful of the Justice Secretary's comments around the nature of racial abuse, the structural and historical dynamics and the sheer numbers that he laid out in his submission last week affected in Scotland, there is a case for a slightly lower threshold, perhaps on symbolic grounds. If you're a solicitor or a sheriff, I can understand why that argument might not hold any weight. But when I was thinking before this session about the Black Lives Matter movement and the great strides that we've taken this year, the world is shining a light on racism and taking steps to combat it. So if I can speak freely, who would be the person at this moment in time that would remove something from the law that acts as a key protection for that community? So I can see why then the Justice Secretary would be a little circumspect in his comments, unless there is clear majority from the affected community that backs its removal, then we wouldn't be prepared to take that step. But it does seem logical and rational in terms of streamlining. Does that answer the question?
And thank you. That's very helpful, Kevin. Thank you. I don't know if we've got Kate Wallace, if she's able to hear or see us. No, it doesn't. It doesn't look like it. Okay. If anyone else wants to comment, if you want to put an R in the chat box. Okay. Thank you, convener. That's me.
Thank you very much, Rona. In that case, can I move to Liam MacArthur, who wants to pick up some of the questioning about free speech and other related matters. Good morning, Liam.
Morning, convener. Morning to our witnesses. I think Shona's going to pick up the issue around the strengthening the provisions in terms of freedom of expression protections that Mr Hopkins referred to. But if I could return to this point about the thresholds, abusive and indeed insulting. Mr Hopkins, you set out quite reasonably an argument in relation to some of the kind of early Nazi propaganda that may not initially have been threatening, although it was highly abusive. Is there not, though, a legitimate concern that abusive and indeed insulting can be fairly subjective, and therefore, while it might capture things which a reasonable person would, I think, quite appropriately see as being captured by this bill and criminalised, it may also, in the minds of those who are on the receiving end, capture things that are perhaps not things that we should be certainly condoning, but nor should we be criminalising either. I think that the point that Mr Kane was making there about the way in which the legislation is understood by those it is seeking to protect is important, and therefore if there's a heightened expectation that these provisions cover abusive and insulting behaviour, then we run the risk of capturing things that we really should not be criminalising. Would you accept that is a concern, Mr Hopkins, first?
Yes, I would. I think it's important that the term abusive is interpreted in an objective way, so that we're not saying that because one person finds something offensive that it would fall foul of this offence. I know that the convener had previously suggested one way to do that might be to require in the bill that the abusive behaviour should be likely to stir up fear or alarm. I don't think that that's quite the right solution, because I think that mixes up two different offences. The offence in Section 38 of the 2010 Act, which is threatening or abusive behaviour likely to stir up fear or alarm, and this offence, which is threatening or abusive behaviour intended to stir up hatred, which is a different thing. So I would suggest a different solution. If we want the bill to specifically say that abusive should be interpreted objectively, I would suggest using the solution in Section 60 of the Sexual Offences Scotland Act 2009, which ensures that the word sexual is interpreted objectively for the purposes of that act. And if you copy that across to this bill, you would have a provision that says behaviour or material is abusive if a reasonable person would, in all the circumstances of the case, consider it to be abusive. That would ensure that the term abusive is interpreted by everybody in the criminal justice system in an objective way, and I think would allay the concerns that people are going to be investigated or prosecuted because one person said, I found that offensive.
That's helpful. Maybe I'll come to Colin McFarlane maybe in a second, but just return to you, Mr. Hopkins, on that specific issue. I suppose with any change in the law, there's always a tendency for it to be probed and pushed to test the limits to which it extends. Would you envisage with this a risk that very provision might be a focal point for testing, and that we see cases kind of being brought forward that are maybe not mischievous, but certainly are likely to cause anxieties around freedom of expression, simply because police are being asked to get involved, the Crown Office are being asked to get involved?
Yeah, I think the key answer there is to make sure that the training is done for the police and for procurators fiscal before the legislation comes into effect. I mean, I think the pushing of the boundaries that you've mentioned, it's something that happens anyway. It could happen with a number of new criminal offences. So I do think it's important that the police in particular are trained in advance of the legislation coming into effect so that they can be clear to somebody what the boundary of the offence is. I do think that threatening or abusive behaviour that is intended to stir up hatred is a high threshold, and it's important that the police understand that.
Okay, thank you. Colin McFarlane, and then if anybody else wants to come in on the back of Colin, if you could indicate in the chat box. Colin.
I don't honestly have anything really to add. I particularly agree with Tim's points, and I do think the clarity aspect for those who will be maybe expected to prosecute or to take that up is going to be absolutely crucial. I think that the training is absolutely central to this piece about the understanding of what that thresholds and those thresholds will be. So I agree with what Tim says. Your point about pushing the boundaries, Tim is right that whenever there's new legislation, people may want to test it. But I think the crucial aspect of that will be the training and the learning and the understanding of those who will be expected to implement this. So I've got nothing further to add really than that.
Well, thank you. I maybe just ask Mr. Wilkes if you wanted to come back if there are any concerns that the Equality Human Rights Commission might have in this regard.
Thank you. I think broadly we'd endorse the comments of Tim and Colin. I mean, clearly this is one area of the bill where the drawing of legislation needs to be done very carefully. We need to get the balance to protect the issue of freedom of expression. Obviously, that's not an absolute right, of course. So material depending on circumstances and context, and it's always the circumstances and context issue, amount to threatening or abusive behaviour is not protected. We did note in some of the previous evidence sessions, I think from the Faculty of Advocates, that the term abusive is clear and understood as an objective test in Scots law, so that may bring some comfort. This is an area that is discussed in many different fora, and we discussed it in our legal framework, which we published in 2015, on the hate speech and the limitations of freedom of expression as defined under the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. Also note that work has been done by the Office of Human Rights Commission, United Nations, on the Rabat Plan, which also looks at these divides, and that we think that could be a useful guide to look at these areas of interest.
Okay, Thank you. If nobody else has got anything else to add, Convener, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Liam. That's very helpful. I'm afraid, everyone, that we have lost Kate Wallace from Victim Support Scotland because of technical issues that we've been unable to fix. So she's withdrawn from this session, and anything that we want to take up with Kate or with Victim Support Scotland, I'm afraid we'll have to do in correspondence after today. But Shona, I think you want to pick up the questioning from here, please. Shona Robertson.
Thank you, Convener. I want to pick up a question around the provision within the bill for general defence of behaviour, along with the protection for freedom of expression in relation to specific issues. We have received quite a lot of evidence arguing that these provisions need to be strengthened, and I'd like to seek views on this. I'll go to Tim Hopkins first, because Tim referred to this earlier on, just to see if he has anything to add to that. And if there's anybody who hasn't come in so far who would want to respond on this, if you could put R in the chat box.
Thank you. Yes, our supplementary evidence suggested a possible improvement to the bill, which might help allay fears about freedom of expression. And it's something similar to what happened with the equal marriage legislation back in 2014. Concerns were expressed then that introducing same-sex marriage would possibly inhibit people from continuing to say, if it's what they believe, that marriage should only be between a man and a woman. We were very clear that that should not be the effect of the legislation. And so a section was inserted into that bill, section 16 of what's now the Marriage and Civil Partnership Scotland Act 2014, which says, for the avoidance of doubt, nothing in this act affects your rights under Articles 9 and 10 of the European Convention. That's freedom of religion and freedom of speech. So in our supplementary evidence, submitted jointly with a number of other organisations, we suggested that a similar provision could be put into this bill. Now, the ECHR applies anyway, because it applies to prosecutors and to courts anyway, but putting it on the face of the bill in those terms may help give people some reassurance on that. The other issue is that the existing sections 11 and 12 only cover two protected characteristics for freedom of expression, that's religion and sexual orientation, and they only cover certain behaviours within those protected characteristics. So the religion section, for example, doesn't cover criticism of non-religious belief, even though the protected characteristic in the bill for religion covers non-religious belief. And the sexual orientation section, section 12, is different from the English version in that it doesn't cover criticising same-sex marriage. So where do you draw the line? And the problem with measures like sections 11 and 12 is that if you include a list of things that it's okay to say, something will always be left out. So we do think a more general provision would have the benefit of covering all of the protected characteristics, but also being couched in more general terms. It could cover a wider range of behaviour. And the England and Wales Law Commission has considered this in their consultation paper on hate crime law in England. And in that paper, it's paragraph 18274. They point out that the provisions in English law, which are similar to sections 11 and 12, have a general purpose. First of all, to clarify that the law applies to hatred against persons and not against institutions or belief systems. Secondly, to clarify that criticism of behaviour is permitted. And thirdly, to maintain a space for discussion of public policy on potentially controversial issues. And it seems to us that that should be the purpose of a freedom of expression provision in the bill. And if it could be couched in general terms like that, then it would be more useful.
That's very helpful, very detailed, and certainly something I think as a committee we should reflect upon. So thank you for that. Is there anyone else who would like to add to what Tim has said? Okay, if not, Convener, I'm content for oh, sorry.
Kevin Kane has indicated that he would like to go in. So Kevin.
Yeah, just very quickly, and it's just to pick up on Tim's point, and we were supportive of that section 16. The reference to equal marriage was a good one. There's a good framing of wording in there that would commend the committee look at. But just very quickly, some of our organisations in our youth work network are keen to extend the freedom of expression clauses, just picking up on what Tim said, across all the protected characteristics. So just to get on public record that we are open-minded and keen to listen to partners on that, many of whom are with us today. But as has been mentioned in previous sessions, the bill should be convention ready anyway. So arguably there's a case for there not being a non-exhaustive list, and where the defence of reasonableness is concerned, that's a mainstay of Scots law, and it's important to listen to legal opinion on that. And it's hard to fathom a situation where, if behaviour's threatening or abusive with the intent of stirring up hatred, that it could be viewed by the reasonable-minded person in any way, reasonable shape or form. So I'm agreeing with Tim on one hand, but on the other saying the protections are laid out in any bill via the convention in terms of freedom of expression as well.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful. That's all from me, convener.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shona. Could I just ask Colin McFarlane if he has anything that he wants to add on this? Because the reason why I'm picking on you, Colin, and I'm sorry if you think I'm being unfair, is just because I was very struck reading Stonewall's written evidence submitted to the committee, which seemed to be pointing in quite a different direction from the one that Tim Hopkins is pointing in. At paragraph 27 of your written evidence, you say that you remain unconvinced as to the benefits provided to hate crime legislation by protections of freedom of expression with respect to sexual orientation, and you oppose the equivalent section in England and Wales. I just wanted to give you the opportunity of putting a view different from the one that we've heard from Tim this morning, but if you don't want to, then please don't feel compelled to.
Just to put on record that we obviously were one of the organisations that put that supplementary evidence in with the Equality Network and with other LGBT and equalities organisations around the freedom of expression. We do think removing or replacing, sections 11 and 12 with the more general freedom of expression protection would answer and hopefully allay some concerns that some people had with the bill. So again, sorry to repeat, but we do support what Tim's saying, and so there isn't a difference between us.
Okay, that's really helpful to know. Thank you very much. So it's just when we have written evidence that's so strongly written as yours was, and then the oral evidence points in a slightly different direction. I think we just want to understand exactly where you are. But that's a very helpful clarification, Colin. Thank you very much. And with that, Liam Kerr, I'm going to pass the questioning over to you, please.
Thank you, convener, and good morning to the panel. I'll put my first question to Tim Hopkins of the Equality Network, but also Una Brown, if I may, because Una Brown, you've talked about solutions to the question I'm going to ask, which you might want to bring in now. We as a committee have heard concerns that the stirring up offences could be used by some to label opinions as hate speech, and that even if that doesn't ultimately lead to prosecution, the fear of that labelling, the fear of a police investigation ultimately could lead to people self-censoring. So, Tim Hopkins, first of all, do you see this as a danger? And if so, what might be the solutions to that problem?
Yes, thank you very much. So I mentioned part of this earlier on, which is around training for police and for fiscals. I think there's also an issue of publicity. It's important when this legislation comes into effect, if the Parliament passes it, that there's publicity about what this offence is and what kind of things it is intended to be used for. For example, the examples that I mentioned earlier on. I do think that threatening or abusive behaviour that is intended to stir up hatred is a high threshold in itself, and that if that is made public with examples, then I think that will mitigate the sort of thing that you're mentioning. Having said that, of course, so much is said, especially on social media, about any subject with claims being made that virtually any contribution could be hateful and wrong. That's not going to stop. Unfortunately, abuse on social media is a big problem that needs other solutions. But yeah, my answer would be that information about what the offence is intended for and proper training of police and fiscals is the solution to that, I think.
Thank you. Una Brown from Scottish Commission for People with Learning Disabilities. Do you take a different or a similar view?
I think just to go back to some of the earlier points and echo some of that, I think it's important that we say that at SCLD we support the offence for stirring up of hatred and are mindful that Article 10 of the Human Rights Act, freedom of speech, is not an absolute right, but that we have to behave responsibly and respect other people's rights to not incite hatred, violence and discrimination. I would say that while we've been supportive of that offence, we would welcome consideration in a number of areas, particularly about explicitly including learning disability within the category of disability within this section of the bill to ensure that people with learning disabilities are protected from hate speech. The other suggestion we had made in our initial consultation was around producing guidance for media outlets on what would be considered stirring up of hate speech for protected groups, including people with learning disabilities. We believe that these steps would be of critical importance because we know that in the past the media have created to an extent hatred and discrimination of disabled people. I think that was clearly seen in media dialogue surrounding austerity when we saw disabled people discussed as being dependent. I think more recently the way that disabled people have been discussed during the COVID-19 emergency has included a discriminatory discourse emerging from the media that coronavirus would not impact most people and would only affect the vulnerable. I think this kind of statement devalues the worth of people with learning disabilities and creates the idea that they are expendable. I think given that people with learning disabilities die 20 years earlier than the general population, we at SCLD would feel that this type of dialogue isn't appropriate. I therefore think in terms of that bit about how we manage people's expectations and understandings about what they can and can't say, it would be about providing guidance for media outlets, and about what kind of dialogue is appropriate. And that's not about completely limiting what people can say, but just taking into consideration how views are put across. And I would also highlight that this is in line with general comments from the Committee on Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which says that state parties should undertake measures to encourage the media to portray persons with disabilities in a manner consistent with the purpose of the Convention, and to modify harmful views of persons with disabilities, such as sufferers and dependent objects of care without autonomy who are unproductive economic and social burdens to society. Hope that's helpful. Thank you.
Very helpful. Thank you. My second question, unless anyone particularly else wants to come in on that, I'll direct to Tim Hopkins and Colin McFarlane, simply because I'm picking up on something that you said earlier. Both of you made very good points earlier on about training for earlier on police and courts, and then Tim, you just talked about publicity. Picking up on something asked about earlier in the committee's evidence taking, do either of you take a view on whether that training and or the publicity has been adequately factored in to either the financial memorandum generally or into the government's thinking about implementation ultimately? Tim Hopkins.
Well, I did read the financial memorandum, and if I remember rightly, there are two sums of £50,000 in there for things like training. I can't remember whether either of those applies to the police. I've got a feeling that the financial memorandum said that police training is being done regularly anyway, so it would be done as part of that. I think our view is that there's something to be said for improving and extending the police training on equalities. I know that police are under huge pressures, and so any time spent on training is time taken away from the front line. But we were involved about 4 or 5 years ago in a project that was funded by the Equality and Human Rights Commission, where we helped train 70 police officers who then became experts in LGBTI equality in their local areas. But that was a number of years ago, and many of those officers have now moved on. I think it would be helpful to do that again. So, yeah, generally speaking, we would be in favour of more training for the police around equalities generally, part of which could focus on this, but we do recognise that there are resource limitations.
Colin McFarlane, anything to add to that?
It might not surprise you to say that obviously I agree with Tim, and I do think that training aspect and awareness raising aspect is absolutely key for a wider understanding of the communities that the police are there to serve. So I think with regards to the bill, then I agree with Tim that if resources are available, then they should be made to ensure that our police are trained across all the equalities characteristics. I do think there's something about education generally, and education being used as a tool to change hearts and minds, which is why obviously we were supportive of the work around the LGBTI inclusive education working group, and obviously we would say that we would hope the government, the Parliament would continue to support the implementation of that, because if you are learning about identities and about yourself within an education setting, we do know that that changes hearts and minds, and that goes some way in terms of changing how people react and treat people with different characteristics. So the training aspect is absolutely key, but I also think education is really key as well, and I mean that in terms of a school and a college and a further higher education setting too.
We're very grateful. Convener Kevin Kane wishes to respond to this question, and then John Wilkes. So if I may bring in Kevin Kane, please.
Yeah, thank you. We work with youth groups who work with young victims of crime through every step of the criminal justice process. So I can confidently say that we know that victims are not always getting the support that they require from the police, and we know that the majority of them actually don't seek support. We know that they feel that the suitable support, particularly in relation to hate crime, isn't adequate. So if in strengthening these suite of laws is to be effective, we do need that discussion, renewed discussion on identifying and addressing the barriers to reporting and access and support. And to pick up on Una's point, this could be made clear as part of any supporting information around the bill and the promotion of the legislation in 2021. It won't come as a surprise to you that I will be talking up the youth work sector. We can harness a lot of power because we're in communities and we're in schools. That industry, the youth work industry, is a massive contributor to the crime prevention agenda, and we work with two sides of the same coin, perpetrators and victims. So when it comes to education and community building, intergenerational work, our proximity to young people and all the issues that they're facing is what makes us strong. And so we're already well positioned to utilise this infrastructure to provide targeted and holistic support to all young people. So I would just flag that as in terms of answering the question, but also in the financial memorandum and what needs to be done. There's a role for youth work here.
But Kevin, then, if I can press you back on that, because that's a very interesting answer, do I take it from that you feel that the financial memorandum does not adequately provide for the various things that need to happen?
The financial memorandum could be more explicit, absolutely.
Grand, thank you very much. I'll bring in John Wilkes finally on this question, please.
Thank you. I just really wanted to underline our support for the comments made about issue of, in order for this legislation to be effective and build on the development of this legislation over 20 years or so, it's really, really important that those people who are involved in making judgments about what's going on in real life, in the real world, do so with confidence. And I recall I served in another life on the Duncan Morrow Advisory Group on Hate Crime that the government commissioned back in 2015. And when we heard evidence from the police, there was that sense that we're placing a lot of responsibility, often on frontline officers, be absolutely confident on issues of law that sometimes can be a bit daunting. So it's really, really important. And that was also something that Brackadale, I was on the advisory group for Lord Brackadale, was again a theme that came up there. So in terms of making this law a success, which is really important for it to be, it's really important that everybody who's involved in the identification prosecution does so with full understanding and support, and it's got support that's obviously got to be ongoing as well.
Very grateful, thank you.
Liam, thank you very much. I think Tim Hopkins, right at the very beginning of the session, said that even though our focus for the first few questions has been on part 2 of the bill on stirring up, that it's part one of the bill on statutory aggravation, which is the most important part of the bill in practice. And we're going to turn to that with questions from John Finney in a moment. But before we do, can I just make sure that all of our witnesses have had the opportunity to say what they want to the committee this morning about the stirring up offences? I'm conscious in particular, Adam Strakura, that Age Scotland haven't contributed to this part of the conversation. So just before we move on, I just wanted to give you the opportunity of adding anything in this section before we do so. Adam.
Thank you, convener. I was just going to say, again, there are a lot of really good things covered here, and there's not a huge amount to add beyond that. However, we definitely think that there's more to regard to the training involved in this, particularly in part two, and what will be what people's expectations of the bill are, but also how prosecutors can act upon that. And I think as time goes on, there'll be a greater understanding of what things mean. So I think well covered by people before me.
Okay, thank you very much, Adam. In that case, John Finney, I'm going to hand the questioning over to you to take us in a slightly different direction. Thank you.
Many thanks, convener. Good morning, panel. The continued use of statutory aggravations as the core method of prosecuting hate crime in Scotland has been broadly welcomed. If I can maybe pick out some elements of evidence, perhaps in the first instance to yourself, Mr. Hopkins, the Equality Network's evidence, and the interesting phrase that was in there about the aggravation model, if I quote it to you, the aggravation model removes the incentive not to prosecute, separating the burden of proof of the two elements. Now, there's more to it than that. Could you maybe just say a little about that, please? Because I think it's important with a follow-on to that.
Yes, thank you. I think that sentence in our evidence was making a comparison between the statutory aggravation model and the standalone offence model, such as you find in Section 50A of the Criminal Law Consolidation Act. That's the racially aggravated conduct and harassment offence. In the latter case, you have to prove with corroborated evidence both the aggravation and the conduct or harassment to prove the offence. With a statutory aggravation, like aggravations at common law, the statutory aggravation doesn't require corroborated evidence. It only requires one source of evidence to prove the aggravation. The underlying offence, whatever it may be, common assault, abusive or threatening behaviour, whatever it is, obviously does need corroborated evidence. Secondly, in the case of a standalone offence, if you fail to prove that it was racially aggravated, then you can't convict at all. Whereas with a statutory aggravation, if you fail to prove the aggravating factor, you can still convict for the underlying offence. So the system of statutory aggravations is more flexible than using standalone offences. We completely agree that it is the core of hate crime law. There are hundreds times more frequent prosecutions for aggravated offences than there are for the stirring up offence. In the most recent year, there were nearly 1,500 sexual orientation aggravated offences reported to fiscals in Scotland, and 40 or 50 transgender identity aggravated offences for each of the last 4 years. And those range from aggravation, this shows how flexible it is, they range from aggravation of offence like abusive or threatening behaviour, that's the common aggravated offence, through assault, but up to the most serious offences. And in fact, in the last 10 years, since the 2009 Hate Crime Act came into effect, Scottish Government figures show that there have been 7 homophobic homicides in Scotland. So the aggravation is absolutely crucial to identify that all of these offences were motivated by prejudice, to ensure that they're recorded in that way, that they're dealt with by the whole of the criminal justice system in an appropriate way, including sensitive handling by the police, right way through to appropriate sentencing, and recorded as such, so that, for example, repeat offenders can be identified.
Okay, many thanks indeed for that, Mr. Hopkins. A question, if I may, to Mr. Wilkes, because the Equality and Human Rights Commission evidence, Mr. Wilkes, is supportive of the approach of statutory aggravators and if I quote here, this achieves a consistency of approach which can potentially be extended by listing new characteristics for the statutory offences if required in the future. You then go on to mention one of these potential ones. It's not with us yet, so I wouldn't ask you to focus too much on the detail of it, but and that is about misogyny. You say specific deterrence of aggravated offending against women by adding the characteristic of sex has symbolic significance that in itself may not ensure adequate or appropriate protection. Can you maybe help me understand your support, but is it qualified in relation?
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I missed the very last part of what you said.
You're supportive of the principle of aggravations, but you express some reservations in relation to one aspect. You could maybe just cover that.
Yes, okay, and that was about sex. I think you were talking about gender.
Yes.
Righty-ho. Yes, the first point, yes, we are very supportive of the aggravations model approach for hate crime for the reasons that Tim listed. I think it's more easily understood and for all those things. In terms of the issue of sex or misogyny, this was something that was debated quite a lot in the Lord Brackadale group about recognising that there clearly is an issue around hate crime, if you like, targeted towards women. And the debate was really about whether putting something in around sex would address that, recognising that that could also therefore include men in that broader definition, whether there was something more specific around women and the experiences of women. We support the inclusion of sex in the bill at this point, but we also recognise and welcome the working group that's been set up, or the proposal for the working group to be set up to look in more detail at the issues around misogyny. I mean, our 2019 CEDAW Convention of Elimination of Discrimination Against Women report called for further investment in research about misogyny, violence against women and girls. So we look to whatever the outcomes of that group are that may help in clarification of that. But fundamentally, we support the inclusion of sex as an aggravation.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Panel, the Equality Network, Beamish and others have called for a legal requirement to be integrated into bill that places a duty on Scottish Government, police and other relevant duty bearers to develop a bespoke system of hate crime data collection and disaggregation across all characteristics covered. I wonder, Ms. Brown, would you wish to comment on that? Mr. Stahura, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Finney. It's a really good point, actually, to be made elsewhere about this. Data collection is hugely important. It's actually quite difficult at times to get good quality data from Police Scotland about the level of the part of this. Also, when you do get data and information, often the numbers might not seem particularly high. But when you're considering this whole bill in the round and the things it may do in a positive sense, which may increase reporting of different types of offences or incidents, may add further to a better understanding of what's going on across the country, but also give people more confidence to be able to report it because the incidents that happen to them, because these things have been more publicised. So there's absolutely a need here, as with everything that we do in the public sector, to have far better data collection on all types of things, because why we should be able to do that. There's no reason why we shouldn't. And I think actually when you look across justice, you look across even health service, it's often very difficult to get useful data to help look for solutions to the problems that are presented.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Ms. Brown, do you wish to comment on that at all, please?
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you. I think this was something that we put across in our initial consultation response, and for us, we would really want to see learning disability explicitly included within the list of characteristics in the bill, While we understand it would be included under the characteristic of disability, we think it's important that we outline disability, including learning disability and physical impairment. We also want, we had also raised for a duty on public bodies to record disaggregated disability data on hate crime. We believe that can be self-declared by individuals. There were several reasons we believe that to be important. The first being that people with learning disabilities experience hate crime. Even as of last week, SCLD were informed of a serious case of this. What we do know is that between 2014 and 15 and 2018-19, disability aggravated crime has increased by 64% in Scotland. We believe that without separate identification, people with learning disabilities may not recognise this legislation as helpful to them and wouldn't come forward to report crimes. For example, when we met with a group of people with learning disabilities at Fortune Works in Drumchapel, we were told by them that they had real uncertainty regarding reporting hate crime. We think that this needs to be done in line with the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Article 31 on statistics and data collection, and Article 33 on national implementation and monitoring. We feel that without it, the invisibility in published statistics impedes the evidencing and appropriate impedes the evidencing and appropriate implementation and policy measures to ensure justice for this group, and leaves them as a kind of invisible population that we don't talk about. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. A brief question, if I may, convener, to Mr. McFarlane. Mr. McFarlane, in line with existing legislation, the bill states that the court must make clear what difference an aggravation has made to the sentence imposed. Lord Backerdale actually recommended removing this requirement. I wonder if you believe the retention of this requirement is helpful, perhaps in increasing the transparency of sentencing, or do you have any view on it at all, please?
Yeah, I think it's important that the offence is named as such, and I think the aggravations help that. I think it gives a clear distinction about what that potential crime had been, and I think it does give a sense of closure to some respects to victims who have been the victim of a hate crime, to see that named as such. So we're of the view that that is a really important aspect of the justice system and of seeing justice to those people who have been victims of a hate crime.
Many thanks. Mr. Kane?
Yeah, in the absence of Kate Wallace from Victim Support Scotland, I was involved with Victim Support Scotland during the independent review on hate crime, so I'm bringing that experience to bear alongside works with youth groups in the voluntary and local authority sector that work with victims and survivors of all crime. I'm aware that sheriffs have highlighted complexity around the recording and explaining the decisions in the courts. However, the most important thing for young people is that they tell us they feel let down, and if we're taking hate crime seriously, we won't let them down. If that aggravating part of the behaviour is not highlighted as a distinct and key feature of the offence, and they feel necessary that the judge should explain that and include it in his or her deliberations on sentencing, and we know that that's important for validation in this particular crime, and it's also extremely important with recovery. And that's what we need to be thinking about as the part of the wider package of rehabilitation and support, and what we can contribute, how this bill can contribute positively to society. So that might seem like a small piece, but it's really very important for a lot of people, and there's possibly work to be done with statutory bodies there as well in terms of training.
Thank you. Were you wanting back in, Mr. McFarlane?
Very quickly, and just to back up what Kevin was saying there, it would also potentially, hopefully, lead to better reporting, and LGBT people, obviously that's who Stonewall supports. We know that there are low levels of confidence and reporting in the system, and so the aggravator there is absolutely critical and key. And I think if it was to be removed, for example, then we would maybe see less confidence in the system and less confidence in LGBT people reporting. So just to completely back up what Kevin was saying there, and what Tim has said previously as well, it is really important, not only in terms of victims seeing that crime is named, but also giving them confidence that they will report if they have been the victim of a hate crime.
Okay, many thanks indeed. Thanks, panel. Back to you, convener. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. I'm going to move next to Fulton McGregor, please, who wants to ask some questions about hate crime characteristics. And then after Fulton, it'll be Annabel Ewing. Fulton.
Thanks, convener, and good morning, panel. As we know, the bill seeks to add age to existing hate crime characteristics, and I want to ask the panel, do you think that this is the right balance? We've had some suggestion that it may be more helpful if the exploitation of vulnerability, including what's sometimes referred to as elder abuse, was highlighted through a statutory aggravation linked to the perceived vulnerability of the victim. Do you think this is right, or do you think that we need both? And I wonder for this if I could come to John Wilkes, then Adam, then Tim, please.
Thank you very much. On the issue of age, certainly the Commission took the view that didn't believe that it should be a listed characteristic, as didn't think that there would be sufficient evidence to meet the threshold for statutory aggravation. And we agreed, I think, with the Police Scotland's response in that respect about the issue being possibly one more on the perceived vulnerability of older people. And we noted in our evidence that the Scottish Sentencing Council is developing guidelines to set out factors which may make a particular offence under this issue. So that's our view, I think, in terms of the age characteristic.
Okay, thanks for that. Adam, have you got any thoughts in this particular area?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. McGregor. Actually, we're really supportive in the first instance. Obviously, you imagine age being included as a statutory aggravation, and for a number of reasons, actually, and slightly against what has just been said. There's three parts to it which I think are really important. Number one, which would give, and it's been mentioned before, actually, by adding this, is missing. It's a particular characteristic which is missing. So this exercise tidies up the sort of current hate crime legislation. Second part to it is it will give, I'm very sure, older people more confidence in reporting crimes because, like others have said, with different areas and parts of society, either underreporting or a lack of confidence in doing so, and it'll be a big challenge for people to do so. It will give prosecutors more tools to actually take cases forward, as mentioned before, but the corroboration part isn't necessarily statutory aggravation, which would be a helpful element in kids pursuing things and things being taken more seriously. But I've said this before, this can act as quite a big prevention tool to offences being undertaken in the first place. But it's also important to mention this is not just about older people, because there's no age threshold in terms of upper age limit or lower age limit or whatever on this. It's about all ages. So when a crime has been committed as a result of somebody's age, or that hostility as a result of their age, of which there could be many things, it would add more weight to either the sentencing again or that prevention part. But we're also, separate to that, really kind of supportive of the including a kind of a vulnerability element, but conscious after discussions with the Cabinet Secretary for Justice that the Scottish Government had well considered that, but found even the threshold for what vulnerability would be to be incredibly difficult to gauge. And actually, it was an interesting conversation because almost any circumstance in that sense you could potentially use vulnerability. Not suggesting that couldn't happen, but I think that warrants further exploration. And with regard to elder abuse, I know I've been at a committee in the past to discuss elder abuse in this sense, very supportive of more measures, whether it's through statutory aggravation or indeed a standalone crime of elder abuse, because it is hugely underreported. There's nowhere near enough support for those people who are subject to it. They're almost removed from a bad situation in actual fact, as opposed to being protected in the first place. They're taken away from it, which is different to lots of other elements. There's far more that can be done there, but whether or not right now at this junction where we are just now, it might not be possible, but it's definitely worth and worthy of further work and consideration. But that bit about the vulnerability, absolutely took at face value the Justice Secretary's view that it could be applied under any circumstance and could make this even more difficult to do.
Yeah, thanks. That's very, very helpful. Tim, have you anything you would want to come in on this question?
On the issue of the age characteristic in particular, I'd certainly defer to Adam and Kevin's expertise on that. I think also it's widely agreed that crimes motivated by vulnerability are different from crimes motivated by prejudice. I'd be supportive of further exploration of whether there should be a general aggravation that relates to vulnerability, but that's out with the scope of this legislation, I think.
Okay, thanks for that. Moving on about the victim support submission, says there should be a zero tolerance approach to hate crime. Now, I was going to ask Kate Wallace if she could expand on this a bit, but in her absence, I wonder if yourself and I would like to comment on this concept generally, and if you would agree with that, particularly given what you said in your previous answer to John Finney about the group that you that you work with and represent.
Yes, thank you. I would agree in terms of that approach. I think for us it's really important that we see hate crimes against people with learning disabilities criminalised, because at the moment what we generally tend to find happened, or what people with learning disabilities tell us that happen, is that when exploitative crimes or crimes of hate crime are committed against them, they're often referred to adult and support protection processes. The focus is then often put on the people with learning disabilities to protect themselves effectively, and the dialogue becomes, you have not protected yourself. This leaves people with learning disabilities often feeling that they are to blame. Instead, we would say that we need to tackle the societal issues which cause hate crime and enable these crimes to happen, as well as addressing the actions of the perpetrator. We would also, in addition to that, add that we need to see a kind of the hate crime bill sitting within the wider context of societal and systemic cultural change, that looks at how we value people with learning disabilities. I think I'd mentioned earlier in regard to the COVID response that we see numbers of this dialogue which really undervalue people with learning disabilities. So actually we need to create a society in which people with learning disabilities are supported to thrive and live the life they choose. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Una. If I could turn to Colin now. Colin, the Stonewall submission would suggest that you consider that the liability for criminal offences should be even lower than the bill proposes. I'm just wondering if you can clarify if this is the case and maybe elaborate a wee bit on this view for the committee, and to get that on our record, please.
I think our view is... Sorry, am I on? Sorry, yeah. I think a view would be about that is, so our submission does state that, and I think that's pretty much our position on that for that too. So I don't have very much to add to that, I'm afraid.
Okay, fair enough. Thanks for that, Colin. I'd just like to, convener, with your permission, ask a final question to sort of round up, and I do see in the in the chat box that John has wanted to come back in, so perhaps we give him that opportunity here as well. And that's just to ask the panel if they've got any concerns about the way in which the various hate crime characteristics are defined in the bill. Now, I want to point out that my colleague Annabel Ewing will come in later and deal with the sex characteristic, so perhaps that could be left. But in terms of the other characteristics, is there any concerns? And if I could come to Kevin first, as I've not came to him yet, he's got anything he wants to hear, and then come back to John.
I don't think I have anything further to add on that particular point, Fulton.
Okay, that's fine.
Cheers.
John?
Oh, thank you very much. I actually wanted to come back on a point about the age aggravation. And totally, obviously, understand and advise with the issues about the fact that people who are targeted because of whatever reason, their vulnerability, absolutely need to be protected, and that's really, really important. I think the other issue about the age aggravation for us was one of the important things about this hate crime legislation is that we do need to have absolute public understanding support of it. And I think part of the reason around the age is we weren't sure that the public would understand the issue around age and equate it in terms of hate crime of other groups, which they might understand. That was part of the reasoning on that. In terms of the question about the other protected characteristics or characteristics that are being included in the bill, I mean, we support the definitions and the proposals that are being put forward on the other characteristics. I'll obviously leave discussion on sex if that's going to become a separate question. I think the other thing is that there were other groups that might need to be considered, which I don't think have been included, particularly around the issue and debate linked to people like asylum seekers and refugees. And this is something that's cropped up again and again, both in the Morrow report on hate crime and in the Bracadell discussions about whether the drawing up of the definitions would adequately cover groups like that, who there's evidence that they are targeted. And while we think that race under this bill would definitively include colour, nationality, ethnic origins, and therefore draw in groups like Scottish Gypsy Travellers, certainly Equality Act case law is less supportive of an assumption that characteristic race would cover issues of refugees and asylum, but that's maybe something the committee would want to consider.
Okay, thanks for that. I can see that Tim was also wanting back in this question from the group. Tim?
Yes, thank you very much. It was just to say that obviously the bill does make some adjustments to the definition of some of the protected characteristics, in particular the LGBTI-related ones. We're strongly supportive of those changes. I think it's really important, as Una said, that people can see themselves in this legislation. We know from our research that although 2/3 of LGBT people and 80% of trans people have experienced hate crime, and 90% of them have experienced it more than once, we know that 71% have never reported those crimes to the police. So encouraging people to report hate crimes is crucial, and one way of doing that is that people can see the legislation applies to them. In particular, the definition of transgender identity has different wording from the definition used 10 years ago. It doesn't change the scope of the aggravation, and the variations of sex characteristics aggravation in this bill doesn't change what the law covers, because intersexuality was covered in the 2009 Act. But the language here makes it much clearer what these definitions are, and uses language that is much more acceptable to trans people, and from what people have told us, people with variations of sex characteristics to them as well. So we're very supportive for that reason of the changes to the language that's made in this bill.
Okay, thanks for that. That's very helpful. Convener, I don't see anybody else in the chat box saying that they're wanting to come in, so happy to pass back to yourself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fulton, and Annabel Ewing, I think, wants to pick up some of these questions as you indicated, Fulton. So over to Annabel, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning to our panel. Yes, picking up particularly on the issue of the non-inclusion at this stage of the characteristic of sex. If I could ask John Wilkes first, I think he indicated in a reply to John Finney that sex as a characteristic actually was included, or he supported its inclusion. Perhaps he could just clarify his comments, because of course at the moment it is not included. What is included is a provision allowing in due course secondary legislation to be adopted to include it, but it isn't included at the moment. Perhaps in the first instance I could go to John Wilkes just to seek clarification on his previous comment. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, and sorry if I wasn't clear before. We understand that it's included in the sense of it could be activated at a later date, and we are supportive of that. We would be supportive of the aggravation of sex, or indeed gender, depending on which way legislation wants to go, to be included at some point.
Oh, okay, thanks for that. Obviously, sex is the protected characteristic under the Equality Act, and presumably that would be the appropriate language. Therefore, if I could turn to Adam Sakura, he obviously made a case for the inclusion, which is currently proposed, of age as a characteristic. And in that regard, he seemed to be missing part of the puzzle. But obviously, sex is a recognised protected characteristic and is not currently included. And I just wonder if Adam has any comment to make on that.
Thank you for that. I'm not actually sure I've got anything particularly constructive to add to that part. Although our main focus had been on part one, on the introduction of age as a result of discussions of the Bracadero report, and since then, I suspect that when you're looking across it, this has been well debated, the whole bill and every single part. I'm sure the are missing or not strong enough. But I'm afraid to be slightly long-winded, maybe not as well informed about this particular question as I could be or should be. Okay, well, that's an honest answer and succinct. Obviously, Adam had referred to the importance of understanding of the bill and the issue, certainly in written evidence, that this may send a bit of a confusing signal, the non-inclusion at this point, albeit we understand that there will be this working group on misogynistic harassment. I wonder if Kevin Kane has any thoughts on the subject.
Yes, I'll try and follow in Adam's succinct footsteps, and it was actually about the misogynistic harassment working group. Given the variation and strength of feeling involved and the complexity of these issues, the youth work sector would be keen to make representations on that group. But also I think positively the fact that the enabling power is in the bill to revisit the statutory aggravator, I think that's a good place to be at the minute, and it's right and proper that we discuss it in relation to domestic abuse and other areas affecting the female sex, and that was brought up by Engender, Scottish Women's Aid, Rape Crisis, and I think a few others. What we certainly wouldn't want is to rush in with an aggravator that's designed to protect women, and then we have an unintended consequence that actually undermines the female sex. And we do know that there is that concern. It would apply to men and women equally, and the potential for it to be misused, but certainly create misunderstanding is real. We know that very few men suffer abuse on account of their sex, so nailing our colours firmly to the misogynistic harassment group mast.
Okay, thanks for that, Kevin. And one last issue, if I may briefly, convener, to turn to Tim Hopkins. He mentioned in passing the support that there was for the current approach of the bill in terms of intersex and variations in sexual characteristics. Obviously, we have a panel further down the line this morning where I think that issue will be looked at in a bit more detail, but he will recognise, of course, that the support for that is not by any means universal. And, for example, DSD families who will be coming to give evidence this morning take an entirely different view.
Yes, so a couple of points. The first is I know in some evidence that the committee received, written evidence, including, I think, the evidence from DSD families, it was suggested that intersexuality had somehow been put in by mistake into the 2009 Act. We were involved in the development of that Act and the discussion in the Parliament as it was going through, and that's certainly not the case. It was put in deliberately because intersex people in Scotland were asking back in 2008, 2009 to be covered. It was put in the wrong place. It should never have been put under transgender identity because intersex is a completely different characteristic from transgender identity. So we think this bill is doing the right thing by separating out. On the issue of whether people with variations of sex characteristics should be covered by hate crime law, I don't have lived experience of that. You will be hearing from two people who do later on this morning. What I would say is that we've consulted with organisations that are run by people with variations of sex characteristics and also surveyed people with variations of sex characteristics in Scotland, and there did seem to be wide support for including this. It's certainly the case that at least a significant minority in our two surveys on the subject the figures vary between 29% in one survey and 50% in the other survey of people with variations of sex characteristics told us they had experienced hate crime because of their variation of sex characteristics. Now, the numbers are small, so the exact figures are not statistically significant, but that certainly points to at least a significant minority of people with VSCs who are experiencing hate crime because of their VSCs. So our view is, for that reason, it should be covered, and for the reason that it's been covered since 2009, and we should tread very carefully before taking away protections that already exist.
Thanks for that contribution, Tim, and obviously this issue will be explored further. I would say that, having read the submissions, I think the DSD families have concerns about the consultations that there have been or not, and their lack of participation being sought in them. But obviously these are questions we can put to them later. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much, Annabelle. Yes, and we will be hearing from DSD families and others later on this morning. Liam Kerr wants to ask a supplementary, and then after Liam Kerr, it will be James Kelly, please.
Yeah, very grateful, Convener. Kevin Kane, I'm enjoying this evidence session immensely, I'll say, and I thought you raised some interesting points in answer to Annabelle Ewing's questions about the working group. And just, I think what I got from that was that, in principle, you're very in favour of the working group. You can see how it would work, and you would want to input to that. The question that arises in my mind is, because I understand that, but because it's a working group, presumably it is constituted of particular bodies. Not everyone can be part of the working group. So because the bill is going down that mechanism to have a working group that will presumably take evidence, what would be your response if, for example, they didn't come to you for evidence? And if that is a possibility, doesn't that suggest it would be better for MSPs to lead that process, perhaps through this consultation, than, for example, the working group model?
People for that working group should be the people that are invited, and if that's police, legal, bill writing teams, people with the right kind of experience. However, with that in mind, people with lived experience and also those who are advocates for particular groups who can talk to these issues, I would suggest would be preferable, and perhaps working alongside MSPs and elected representatives to bring this to bear. Given that we couldn't get agreement on whether it should be the aggravating factor should be part of this bill, I would put the question back to you perhaps and say, can it be appropriately dealt with by parliamentarians? And there's a bigger question about what is dealt with, generally speaking, by the Parliament, and what can be achieved more meaningfully via a working group who then present their findings to Parliament and work with them to get the desired outcome. So just to make myself a wee bit clearer, not convinced that we should hand this particular hot topic over to parliamentarians.
Thank you.
Right, I'm going to resist the temptation to get involved in what are and what are not appropriate questions for parliamentarians, and I'm going to bring in a very experienced parliamentarian, James Kelly, to ask the final set of questions to this panel. Thank you, James.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning, panel. I want to concentrate on the issues of support for victims of hate crime, and I want to go to Una Brown first of all, and then there's a specific question I want to ask Kevin Kane. Quite happy to take contributions from anyone else. I just wondered, Una, if you had any view on what more needs to be done to support victims of hate crime. I'm thinking in terms of additional reporting or legislation. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Thank you, James. I think, as I had mentioned earlier, one of the key issues for people with learning disabilities in regard to exploitative crime and crimes of hate crime is about being taken seriously, and the onus of having that experiencing that crime not being placed on them. So I think that what we would say is we would need to look at how we make sure that we're not removing people with learning disabilities human rights when they are harmed through adult support and protection and guardianship where it's not necessary. I think that we would say that instead we need to ask people with learning disabilities who have experienced hate crime about what it is that the support they would need and wider consultation on that. In a discussion with the Learning Disability Observatory on research they had conducted about hate crime recently, they had told me a story in which a person may have experienced hate crime and were interviewed publicly regarding that. And so it's about, I think as well, where people live in residential settings, about offering them the opportunity to report crimes in private, especially where there may be people who are aware of certain things. And I think wider than that, we would need to, going back to my earlier points, ensure that people with learning disabilities are considered valuable members of society whose evidence as witnesses is taken seriously and valued. Again, we would also want to look at the consistent use of the appropriate adult system where appropriate, as well as advocacy. And again, going back to earlier points, making sure that people with learning disabilities do not remain invisible in these discussions through adequate data collection. And finally, around providing funding for police awareness and training on learning and intellectual disabilities would also be immensely helpful. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that, Anna. It's very comprehensive, and I think particularly the points you make about talking not just to disability groups but to others in terms of what more needs to be done, and also data collection are really relevant points in this. The final point Una made there was about training for raising awareness among police. So I wanted to go back to Kevin Kane. In response to Liam Kerr's question, you said that more needed to be done to support victims of hate crime, and you particularly gave the example among the police. So what particular measures do you think could be introduced in the bill that would help raise awareness in terms of supporting victims of hate crime and how the police deal with these crimes and deal with the victims?
On the point about police, how they deal with it, I'll just leave that sitting for a wee minute. Scribbled a couple of notes because I had about a minute or two to have a wee think about the question. And just to pick up on the research point, we all agree that lived understanding and the lived experiences of hate crime would benefit everyone. And it's important for us, who supports thousands of youth workers, that we have an in-depth understanding of the issues. So when we're working alongside young people and the statutory bodies, we can drive up the standard and affect culture positively, talk about the impact in communities, and policy people like myself then are able to demand the right kind of changes. There was a second point about under-reporting, which I thought was important earlier on. There are third-party reporting services run by the police, and it's been a bit patchy, and there's been talk of a renewal of that or starting it afresh. Now, I'm not aware of any update on what's happening with the third-party reporting, but I know from having worked from an organisation that was a third-party reporting service, there were issues about people understanding that it was available. So you could report the crime, and it wouldn't even need to be reported. You could come and you would have the option that would be reported directly from an organisation to the police, and they would get the support they deserve. That's not really happening at the minute. That's the feedback that I'm getting. And on the last point, I think restorative justice, I did mention this in our submission. We're interested in discussing how the restorative justice could fit with hate crime and across the other government objectives at the minute. We appreciate this would need to be done carefully with victims so it doesn't lead to further victimisation, but there has been pilots on restorative justice a number of years ago. Local authorities showed mixed results. There was limited take-up in schools. So I wonder if the hate crime bill is an opportunity to kickstart some of these activities again, and with the youth work sector in that unique position in schools and communities dealing with both perpetrators and victims of crime, to answer your question, could benefit both the offender and the victim and contribute to that community cohesion that we talk about so much. I would like to see the bigger picture discussed a little bit more.
Okay, thanks for that. Kevin, if we can go to Colin McFarlane, who's indicated he wants to come in on this. Colin.
Thank you. It was primarily just to back up something Kevin just said there about third-party reporting. They are under-resourced and they are patchy, and actually from an LGBT perspective, they're actually crucial. There are LGBT people who have experienced hate crime who will not report it because they fear that that might out them. So in many circumstances, there are LGBT people who are not out, whether in their families or in their communities. If you're looking at particularly for rural areas where the communities are smaller, third-party reporting does provide a way where those victims of hate crime, LGBT victims of hate crime, will be able to do that without potentially outing themselves to their wider community. And I think that's something that's not actually acutely understood. And I think the whole thing about that third reporting system being properly resourced is really, really crucial from our perspective. Thank you.
Thanks, Colin. I think that's an important point to make. Can we just go to John Wilkes, who also wants in on this? John?
Thank you very much. I just wanted to add the Commission's huge support to the point about it's so important. While we're talking about legislation and the need to get that absolutely right, get the right balances and checks in place so that we have a platform of hate crime legislation that means victims can get justice, and perpetrators understand that this is not acceptable in Scottish society. The thing that's always come through in all the groups I've ever worked on around this issue has been the absolute devastation that these crimes can cause to individuals who are targeted because of their identity, the corrosive nature of this sort of crime to community cohesion. So it's really, really important that alongside getting the law right, we absolutely need to ensure that victims of this insidious issue are fully supported.
Thanks a lot for bringing that forward, John. And Tim Hopkins has now indicated he wants to come in. So, Tim.
Thanks very much. Totally support the points that have just been made, and maybe I could add two more things. One of the ways to encourage people to feel they can report hate crime is public awareness campaigns. And we really like the fact that the Scottish Government does an annual public awareness campaign on hate crime. I think when you see an advert on a bus stop in Princes Street that says there is no place for hate crime in Scotland, and in particular when there are targeted adverts that talk about race hate crime, transphobic hate crime, homophobic hate crime, and so on, you really understand that message and feel, yes, I can report this. The second point is that it's important that when people do report the crime, that they have a good experience. And the survey work that we've done indicates that people's experiences of the police are getting better. And in fact, the majority of people now in our surveys say they had a good experience with the police, although a minority don't. Where people find the system is less satisfactory is when it gets to the prosecution stage and the court stage. In fact, the significant majority say they were dissatisfied with their interaction with the fiscal and that they were dissatisfied with the court process. And a lot of that seems to be around lack of communication and lack of information. I know this goes wider than hate crime because people say this about all sorts of crime. But I think that there is an issue there of ensuring that the Fiscal's Office communicates well with complainants and that the court communicates what the process is and what's going on better than they do at the moment.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks to the panel for a comprehensive set of views on what needs to be done to give more support to victims. Nobody else has indicated they want to come in, so back to you, Convener.
Thank you very much, James. And can I just echo and endorse what James just said there? I mean, I'm very grateful to you all on behalf of the whole committee for your evidence this morning, and in particular, if I may say so, for getting us to think a little bit beyond this bill. For understandable reasons, the committee has been very focused on what is in the bill for the last few weeks, and getting us to think about what, in addition, government, society, and Parliament need to do to tackle hate has been really helpful this morning. So thank you all very much indeed We're going to suspend for 5 minutes just to enable broadcasting to make sure that our next panel of witnesses are all with us online. So we will reconvene at 10:35. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone, and welcome. I'd like to welcome our second panel today. And we have with us now Danny Boyle from BMIS, Jennifer Galbraith from the Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights, and Amy Allard Dunbar from Intercultural Youth Scotland. Welcome to all of you. Thank you very much for joining us. And this is not a formally declarable interest, but I would just like to remind members of the committee that I have during this Parliament been associated with the cross-party group on race and race relations chaired by Fulton McGregor. And so I'd like everyone to bear that appropriately in mind. I'm going to ask Rona Mackay to open the questioning to this panel. Rona, so over to you directly, please.
Thank you, convener. Good morning, panel. Yes, I'd like to ask about the different approach to race hate crime in the bill and just everything that surrounds that. We know that 2/3 of all hate crime is race related. So can I ask you, do you believe that the race crime should be treated differently? Should we be taking a more robust approach to it given the prevalence of it? And does it create a hierarchy of characteristics? And could I ask you maybe to, in your answers, address a couple of points that were raised in the last panel? One from Kevin Kane, who said that removing insulting from that part of the bill would dilute the meaning educationally and otherwise of it. Because obviously we know that it doesn't require intent, but it does have insulting. So, would you agree with that? It might risk diluting it. And the other one was that John Wilkes from the EHRC said that race characteristics wouldn't cover refugees or asylum seekers from hate crimes. So, if you could maybe address that point too, I'd appreciate it. Could I possibly go to Danny first, Jennifer, and then Amy, please?
Thank you very much, Rona, for that comprehensive question. And good morning, committee members, and thanks for having us here today. I'll make the case on why race has to be treated in a very specific function, that it doesn't reflect a hierarchy, but rather just the reality of the prevalence of contemporary racial hatred and historical racial hatred. I'll place it in the context of why the definition of racial discrimination is what it is, and also respond to the points you've made around about insulting and race, and John Wilkes' point about asylum seekers and refugees. So first of all, the committee's already identified this morning, as has many of the witnesses thus far, that the issue of racially aggravated hate crime in Scotland by far and away dominates the issue of hate crime in Scotland. It's a pervasive issue which has now, every year since devolution, for example, has by far and away reflected the significant issue. And just to place that in a bit of context, when we're talking about race and racism and why it's so important, obviously we've seen in more recent times globally the issue of race and institutional racial discrimination being put much more into the public spotlight. But just for committee members, for the general public watching in, for police officers, for people who take an interest in this piece of work, where does the definition race, colour, nationality, ethnic or national origin come from? That definition comes from the desolation of the Second World War, from the development of the UN monitoring system and the creation of the first international treaty to deal with racial discrimination. Now, that treaty came off the back of a moment of international clarity, off the back of the Sharpeville massacre in apartheid South Africa in 1960. Within a decade, the international community has come to an understanding and recognition that race and racism is such a prevalent, significant issue that it's something that we'll need to take significant action on. So that's why race has some very particular importance globally, but also in Scotland, and we see that reflected in the significant number of racial hate crimes which occur. Now, you're referring to the point about insulting within the standalone offence, stirring up a racial hatred. Again, why that's so prevalent, if we're linking the international system to our domestic challenges, then we see that it's such a broad definition through the international system we've incorporated into our domestic legal regime. because we know the issue of racism and race is ubiquitous across the globe. So each jurisdiction has to have the capability to respond to the variations in racism which will occur in its jurisdiction at any given time, and that continually evolves. So the reason why we had the stirring up of racial hatred in 1986 in the UK is because we saw a significant increase in manifestation of far-right groups targeting people on the basis of their colour of skin and targeting people on their ethnicity, their nationality, so on and so forth. So the reason why that threshold of insulting is there is because we have warning bells from history over a significant period of time that insulting behaviour can then escalate into, significant and human rights violations. So that's why that particular aspect deals with it. And maybe later on in the session we'll come on to talk about the issue of data gaps and why that's also incredibly important. But I won't go there just now. Just final point on John Wilkes' point about refugees and asylum seekers. Our position would be that they actually would be covered by either the aggravation standalone offence or the stirring up charge on the basis of their colour, their nationality, their ethnic national origin. So we would maybe take a slightly different view, but I think that would be a conversation. Look to have some clarity from an EHRC on why they feel that's the way it is, if there is a vulnerability in the law, because they are targeted quite consistently at the moment.
Sure.
So fit there for the time being, but I just think it's important. Historical context of the UK and the context of Scotland, and hopefully we can embellish on that as we go through the session.
Thanks, Danny. That's really useful. Jennifer, can I come to you, please?
Thank you. So essentially, yes, we regarding races, can kind of flip the question here. So essentially what you're saying is that race should be treated differently. Race shouldn't be treated the way it's been treated for the last several decades. The Cabinet Secretary said recently in the CPG on race equality that you can't treat an imbalanced situation as balanced. And we've already heard that statistics on hate crime in regards to race are significantly higher than other characteristics. And they make up the majority of charges and convictions over the last several years. Regarding insulting, it was communicated in the EQIA from the Scottish Government that it could lead to people thinking that it was permissible to then insult people on the basis of their race. And this is something that we have significant concerns about. And so we would agree that it would dilute the protections, even if it's not being used in a legal context. In reality, in the everyday lived experience, it could have potential harmful effect on BME communities within Scotland. And in regards to the refugee and asylum seeker point, it's very hard to imagine a circumstance where someone is going to do insulting, threatening or abusive behaviour towards someone knowing their immigration status. While immigration status isn't specifically mentioned in the bill, again, it's hard that someone would know someone's immigration status before they commit an offence. And so we believe it would be adequately covered within the current provisions.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. Thanks, that's helpful. Amy, please.
Hi, I don't know if you'll be able to hear my audio okay, because you might have just switched my video off if you can't hear
it's fine.
So just let me know.
It's fine.
It's fine, yeah. Fabulous. Yeah, so thank you very much once again for having me. It's really nice to be here and to see some of people I've worked with. Danny from BMS, it's really nice to be here. So addressing the questions that you posed to us. So first of all, I'd say that race definitely needs to be dealt with separately, echoing what other people have said. Primarily, I would say it's due to the historical and institutional nature of racism. And often what we see is when race is kind of in amongst other like equality groups and equality spaces and bills, race tends to be the protected characteristic that's often left behind, that's ignored. And there's lots of protected characteristics and groups that we can see that have made a lot of progress throughout the years in Scotland, but with race and race relations, it just seems to be something that we really can't make a lot of steps with, and that is because it is really something that's really difficult to tackle and it's so institutional. And also the problems with the current structuring of how race is dealt with, if it was a part of the consolidated bill, is that some of the main issues is that unless an intersectional or unless the framework of intersectionality was adopted, which is a framework that allows multiple identities to be considered in one instance. So in terms of if, for example, it was a Black transgender man, then in that instance, that would be understood as kind of two levels of discrimination, like under like gender and race. But because that framework is is very difficult for reporting bodies and for other people to kind of take into account, that's a very idealistic way to kind of deal with hate crime, and we just don't see that has the potential to be taken up correctly and understood about how to operate in that manner. So we really see that for race to be understood properly, it needs to be done separately, because currently as things stand, the institutions just really don't have a good understanding of racism, and it's so institutional that there's so much unlearning to do, and it will not be tackled correctly if it's with the other protected characteristics. So on the other matters, so in terms of insulting in regards to race, I think I also agree with everyone else in terms of what is a big problem is that microaggressions and kind of the level of understanding when it comes to kind of like non-covert racism is really difficult. So in terms of understanding microaggressions and their impact, they're kind of daily instances of racism that kind of really add up to cause significant racial trauma. And a lot of them can come under the instances of insulting, and it's really hard to understand the impact of that if they aren't included in this bill. So we do see the need to keep that in. And also in terms of like the pyramid of white supremacy, I don't know if it's a concept that many people might have heard of, but in terms of how that operates is that the bottom level is kind of covert acts of racism, and then at the top would be all the way up to genocide. So like what happens at the bottom levels of discrimination and kind of insults and things like that is when they are continuously allowed, then the kind of the discrimination and the violence escalates to a point that you get vilified and accepted violence, and then all the way up to genocide, as I said. So we really see that there really can't be a point where you start it just has to be everything is included. And in terms of the point also on including of immigration status, we also see that race, although people understand it as a very kind of clear thing, as a protected characteristic and as it would be understood if race was dealt with differently, we think it would adequately cover immigration status kind of in a more kind of broad general sense. So hopefully that covers everything. I'm sorry about my audio and the video and audio.
No, that's fine. We actually could hear you the second part of your answer a bit better, I think, when you went just to audio. Can I just ask you, Amy, do you think is there more that could be done in respect of race? Are we tackling it? Are we being robust enough, basically, with how we're doing it? I know we'll flesh this out in further questions from my colleagues, but if I could just maybe ask you, Amy, what you think of that?
I definitely think that race is an area that is not being dealt with robustly enough. Otherwise, there would have been significant improvements that were easy to measure and were easy to measure. And I think it's quite disheartening that so many other protected characteristics groups have made significant progress over the years, and it just seems to be that race just doesn't make any significant improvement. And I know it seems like a very small thing, but for example, there was a Christmas advert that went out yesterday, and it was showing a Black family, and it literally received so many complaints and insults, and there was so many hatred and racism under the comments on it on social media. And it's like the tiniest things, such as a Christmas advert that features a Black family, receives so much backlash. And it's like, if something as tiny as that is such a problem for the Scottish population, then clearly we have not got to a point where race is something that is talked about enough or understood correctly. And I think the main problem is I know that people are afraid of getting it wrong, and I know it's a really difficult thing to talk about and to tackle if you aren't a person of colour, if you aren't Black. but it really needs to be something that is done now, because the people that are suffering the most are Black and POC young people particularly, and the communities in general. And it's really difficult to be able to advocate for yourself and do all of this work by yourself. We really need people in positions of power, like a lot of yourselves, to be able to elevate and provide equitable support and really start making lots of headway when it comes to race, because it just isn't getting there.
Okay, thanks, Amy. You made a very strong point there. I think Danny wants to come in. I'm not sure if Liam, did you want to come in? Liam McCarthy?
Rona, if you bring in the other two witnesses, I'll bring in the other members, okay?
All right, okay. Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think Danny, did you want to come back?
Thanks very much, Rona, and I'll be as brief as I possibly can. Amy raises a number of really critical points there, and I think that's one of the big challenges, not just for this committee, but for Parliament and society more broadly, is to find where responses to the challenges which Amy has identified are most appropriately situated. Though when Amy's raising issues around about microaggressions and that experience of being a young person of colour or nationality or ethnic or national origin in Scotland, the reality is that those microaggressions are very unlikely to meet a criminal threshold, either as a standalone offence or as certainly not as a stirring up of racial hatred offence. So it's there the question is set to us as a society and the committee and whatever deliberations you then progress forward, is how do we challenge the microaggressions while also using the
I think Danny might have frozen there.
Danny's just dropped off, so we're going to have to try and reconnect you. But I know Jennifer Galbraith wants to come back in on this as well, and then we'll move on if that's all right, Rona. Jennifer.
Oh, yeah, sure.
No, I just wanted to add a point to the clarification around refugees and asylum seekers. And it was, if there is any doubt on this, it would be worth doing a review of evidence of existing cases to see if there was indeed a gap. As I said, we believe it would be covered, but we would need a review as well, just to make sure.
Thanks. Thank you, Jennifer. Thanks. Convener, that's me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rona. Liam MacArthur wants to come in with a quick supplementary, and then after Liam, it'll be Shona Robertson, please. Liam.
Thanks, Convener, and good morning, panel. I suspect this was probably more directed at Danny, so if he's dropped off the call, it may be a moot point. I mean, I'll ask Jennifer and Amy as well. The point being made, I think, was that there's an escalation in terms of insults, abuse, and more serious behaviours, and if you don't address those early enough, the risk of that escalation only increases, which I think we would all accept. I would also certainly accept the point about the different nature of hate crime in relation to different characteristics. I suppose the concern I would have, and we've heard it from some of the other witnesses, is that if we set the criminal threshold too low, we risk capturing things that really should not be criminalising, we should be addressing through other means, whether that be through education or whether it be through other interventions. And therefore I just wonder, maybe starting with Amy, coming to Jennifer, and I think it would be unfair to ask Danny if he hasn't even heard the question to respond, but maybe Amy could start with responding to that concern.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. So that kind of segues quite nicely onto kind of what I wanted to make sure that we covered next was alternatives to the current legislation, alternative to the current systems. Although it seems very idealistic for me to say it would be great to defund and restructure the current systems, it is a very idealistic notion, but it is this way in which all protected characteristics in society and all groups that have faced significant oppression would adequately be supported by the current systems in place. Our organisation has done a number of reports to, and all of them are available online, that look at the relationship with young people and the criminal justice system and the police, and the level of distrust and ability to understand and to have yet to have trust in those systems just isn't there at all. And we would agree that moving to alternatives would obviously move away from the need to criminalise everything when it came to this bill. So if we moved to alternatives such as restorative justice and a community support network that was ran by people with lived experiences of hate crimes themselves, the benefits of this is that, yes, we wouldn't be criminalising everything, we'd be picking everything up rather than ignoring the microaggressions, for example. We would pick everything up, and then through education such as peer education, which we found works significantly well when it comes to incidents of racism. Peer education really works really well in understanding, being able to put yourself in the victim's shoes. And so we think that those means would kind of deal with a lot of the issues that have kind of been brought up in regards to that. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thanks, Kemi. That's been helpful. Jennifer, I don't know, do you have anything you want to say in response?
Yes, so I guess regarding the lowering of the thresholds, I can only really speak on behalf of race here, not the other characteristics. But essentially, insulting has been a part of the legislation for decades, and if there was an issue with this, I'm sure we would have found out about it by now. And in regards to the other characteristics, something I meant to add earlier is if other groups were wanting extensions and it was evidence that they were needed, then we would have no objection to them being extended, the protections.
Okay, thank you. Danny, the point or the question I was asking in response to something you were saying earlier, and Amy had picked up about the risk of escalation, as you were, I think, talking about the microaggressions and where those can potentially be can lead to, if not addressed. But I suppose the question I was raising was about whether or not that sits in terms of where the criminal justice sector needs to engage, or whether it needs to engage other interventions that would hopefully reduce the risk that you're talking about, maybe through education or as Amy's saying, restorative justice options.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm happy to respond to that. Sorry, I don't know where I get cut off last time, so I'll be as brief as possible. I'm competing with my 18-month-old who's doing that Tiny Talk singing class at the moment, so apologies for that. Yeah, so the microaggressions point is this, so we can't just completely ignore it. That's not what I was saying, so just to clarify that. But it's just for the purposes of this committee and the bill, it sits somewhere separately to what our intervention needs to be. And Amy's correctly, as you've nicely summarised there, picked up on some of the non-judicial interventions which are required to be taken forward. One I would highlight, and there's two parallel issues here which are under review by the International Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination at the moment, and pertain specifically and directly to Scotland, is a point around about education and a point around about racially aggravated hate crime data disaggregation, because we need to have these two things happening concurrently in order to actually have an understanding of where these non-judicial interventions need to be prioritised and taking place. The point on the curriculum, which the committee has identified, which to some degree is where the acceptability of individuals' behaviour when it comes to microaggressions derives from, is a perception which is based upon communities' experiences historically, past and present, in other jurisdictions and here within Scotland and the UK, of British colonialism, imperialism, the slave trade and other grave human rights violations. It's these building blocks which have enabled people over a sustained period of time to view people of colour or different nationality or ethnic or national origin as somehow being worthy of disdain based upon those specific characteristics. So the point within the Scottish education system, which is ongoing at the moment, is to unpick the legacy of colonialism within our domestic, devolved areas of governance, and be that in education, and understand what impact that global vision and the why different communities live and exist in Scotland, and the microaggressions which may flow from it, or other prejudice or inequalities which come from that hierarchy of understanding of different communities. What has to happen alongside that, however, is a full disaggregation of the nature of racist hate crime in Scotland. We need to know what black people, what white people, what Asian people, what other people are actually targeted by racially aggravated hate crime in Scotland in order to inform those non-judicial interventions. So there's quite a lot that has to happen around about this, and I'll leave it there just now.
Okay, thanks very much. I know others are wanting to come in, but I'll leave them to come in at a later stage, Anne.
Thank you. Yeah, indeed. I know the other witnesses want to come in, but I'm going to bring in Shona Robertson next, and she can invite Jennifer and Amy to say what they want to say in addition to responding to her questions, please. So Shona, over to you, and then after Shona, it'll be Liam Kerr.
Okay, thanks, convener. Morning, panel. I want to pick up on the provision in the bill for a general defence of reasonable behaviour, along with protection for freedom of expression in relation to specific issues. And we have received a fair amount of evidence arguing that those provisions need to be strengthened. So I just want the panel's views on this. And convener said maybe come to Jennifer and Amy first.
Okay. Sorry. Regarding freedom of expression, it's our view that there's never going to be a situation where abusive or threatening language based on someone's race is appropriate. I can't speak for the other characteristics. I know the bill largely discusses religion and sexual orientation. And apologies, sorry, what was the first part of your question again?
It was really about the general defence of reasonable behaviour and whether or not that the provisions need to be strengthened, and what your view is on that. Yeah.
Okay. So this is something that I'm looking into at the moment, so I'd be happy to send something to the committee afterwards, if that would be useful. And if I can just jump in, if I'm allowed, on the point I wanted to add earlier. Just around other interventions, it's a kind of two-way process. So we need interventions to stop kind of low-level racism, if you want to call it that. And we also need robust law and legislation to deal with the actual hate crimes, essentially to communicate to society that that behaviour is not tolerable. Just wanted to add that on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. Amy?
So in terms of the reasonable provisions, I don't have particularly much to add, just in terms of, I wasn't as an organisation, we got brought very late into this whole process, so it's not something I've had time to adequately give you a perspective on, so I'll just leave it at the moment. And in terms of kind of your other point about what is included, I would agree with what Jennifer said in terms of making sure that every kind of level is adequately covered within the bill, because I don't think anything should really be excused at this point.
Okay, and finally, Danny.
Thanks very much. Just two very brief points. Again, the stirring up of racial hatred, we're not aware of a general defence of reasonable behaviour being a problem for the prosecution of that in the years going past. But I would make a general point in terms of ECHR compliance, that the bill will, both in terms of stirring up of racial hatred, which we don't see any problems coming down the line with, but in terms of the other characteristics, that the bill will need to be, there has to be consensus, and it will need to be watertight, because there is such a significant interest in this legislation from so many different areas, that what we would not want to see is the beneficial and positive parts of consolidating hate crime law and making it much more easier for people to access remedies to be undermined by an ECHR compliance case, which would put the whole bill in jeopardy. So we would make an appeal for consensus on the other stirring up offences moving forward.
Okay, thank you. That's fine, convener.
Thank you very much, Shona. And then Liam Kerr to wrap up the questioning on this aspect of the bill before we move to John Finney, please. Liam.
Thank you, convener. Just very briefly, several of you have made points you'll have heard in the first panel about as well training, especially for police and courts, and you've talked about restorative justice and wider public education. Do any of you take a view on whether the financial memorandum, or just more generally about the resources behind this, adequately makes provision for what you would think needs to be done to make this work? I'll go to Danny Boyle first, please.
Thanks, Liam. We've not had the opportunity thus far to review the full financial memorandum, but I will make general points that we would like to see in it. I know the Scottish Police Federation identified concerns about the retraining of officers to cover all the different circumstances which may prevail within the bill. However, our position would be that it is a fundamental responsibility of people who are here to serve law and order, be that in the COPFS or within Police Scotland, that individual police officers should be given the adequate training and the financial support to progress that training in order that they're able to have a comprehensive understanding of the different legal definitions connected to the different statutory aggravations. And I would like to think, that's not just something that we've outlined or would support with regards to police, but society more broadly in the conversations we're having here, that the story that we put forward at the beginning of where this all derives from the UN system, from the end of World War II, a global consensus, apartheid, that's actually, it's a very interesting story. It's a story that we should know anyway, and why our hate crime law.
Danny, I'm sorry to cut across you, but with the greatest respect in the world, we do not have time to go through all of that story this morning. You've already mentioned all of those issues, and there's a very specific question from Mr. Kerr about the financial memorandum. So if I could just ask you, with the greatest respect, to stay focused on that would help the committee very much in its deliberations. Thank you.
Unless there's anything else to say, Danny, Jennifer, do you have anything to say on that, the financial memorandum?
I don't have anything to say specifically on the financial memorandum, just more that we need more additional investment in training and also more PME recruitment as well for the police force and for law agencies in general. Again, this is something I'm happy to write in about, but I'm aware that HMICS are doing a thematic review on hate crime at the moment, which again should cover aspects of this as well.
Very grateful. Amy, would you like to comment on this?
I also haven't had time to adequately go over the financial aspect of and what I would just add would simply be that and kind of echoing everyone else, is that the police do not have adequate training. They do not have significant anti-racist training or cultural proficiency training, and either do a lot of other people that are in institutions that would be dealing with the process of hate crimes. So really don't think that the current situations are adequately prepared to deal with race as a hate crime in general. So that's kind of all I really have to add.
Very helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. John Finney, please.
Thank you, convener. Good morning, panel. Panel, as in the previous session, I want to ask about aggravation of offences by prejudice, and the continued use of aggravations as the core method of prosecuting hate crime in Scotland has been broadly welcomed, if any of the panel members have a specific comment on that, I'd welcome that. If not, I'd like to come to Mr. Boyle about, and if you were watching the previous session, well, you'll know that I mentioned Bemis in relation to a request that you've joined into with other organisations. That's a call for a legal requirement to be integrated into the bill that places a duty on the Scottish Government, Police Scotland and other relevant duty bearers to develop a bespoke system of hate crime data collection and disaggregation across all characteristics covered by this proposed legislation. I wonder, could you comment on that, please?
I'd be happy to. When the regional police forces were amalgamated into Police Scotland 2014, if memory serves me correct, then we lost the ability to have any disaggregation on the nature of victim, complainer or witness of racially aggravated hate crimes and incidents in Scotland. As I mentioned earlier, we have the international oversight of that, and in order to actually have a coherent response to racially aggravated hate crime in Scotland, as opposed to getting these block figures of 4,500 in 2017-18 or whatever it may be, we actually need to know which specific ethnic groups are being targeted. As an example, we would see from the figures we did have available, which were provided to the committee from 2004 to 4-5 to 13-14, whenever there was an international terrorist incident, then we saw a significant spike in victims, witness, complainers being of Pakistani ethnicity, likely linked to Islamophobia. So it's incredibly important that we have this data on a rolling basis, because the nature of racially aggravated hate crimes evolves in different circumstances and at different times. And to give an example right now that we're dealing with Police Scotland and the community involved, as a result of the perceived origin of the coronavirus pandemic, we've seen an upsurge in racist incidents and hate crimes affecting East and Southeast Asian communities. So for these reasons, it's very important that we have an annual disaggregation to inform non-judicial interventions, but also to be able to forecast potential vulnerabilities for different groups due to geopolitical situations.
Many thanks indeed for that, Mr. Boyle. I wonder if either of the other two witnesses would comment to that, particular maybe the benefit for the non-judicial interventions, as Mr. Boyle highlighted.
I would kind of just echo what Danny was saying, really, in terms of being able to, I think, specifically map what groups are being more disproportionately targeted at particular times, because as he highlighted, after the coronavirus, there has been significant increase in racism towards the Southeast Asian and Asian community. So it's very difficult to, and that is something that's really important to map, and particularly after Brexit as well, there was a lot of increase in hate crime towards people that were from other parts of Europe. So and their perception, or even if they were perceived as being from other parts of Europe, that is really important to be able to map, because that is how it understands how society responds to particular events, and that in turn reflects their general perceptions and views about those groups. And it's really important to be able to understand that in a, as Danny said, less than a 3,000 figure and more like, a smaller amount of numbers.
Thank you. Dr. Galbraith.
Thank you for the question. We actually included in our submission there should be a reporting requirement for ministers, and this was based on the Domestic Abuse Scotland Act in 2018. So in this sense, annually a report would be produced which would include a breakdown of statistics, and we specifically asked for disaggregated ethnicity for accused and victims by the census categories. I believe having a requirement to produce data alone may not work in practice, because we do already have that requirement for the public sector equality duties, and we already see that doesn't essentially work in practice. So if it was to be a data requirement, it would have to be very strict.
Thank you. That's very helpful indeed. Thank you, and I recognise the wider benefits that was included that could be delivered. A further question, if I may, in line with existing legislation, the bill states that the court must make clear what difference an aggravation is made to the sentence imposed. Now, Lord Bracadale recommended removing this requirement, and is the retention helpful, perhaps with regard to transparency of sentencing? Dr. Galbraith?
Yeah, so we believe it is helpful, and we agree with keeping the transparency around the additional sentencing and aggravation adds on, because it gives validation to victims as well that their complaints have been heard and racism has been treated accordingly. So it does provide an important support for victims in this case, and provide more confidence in the criminal justice system and its tackling of racism.
Thank you. Ms. Alderden-Barr?
Could you actually repeat the question? I think I misinterpreted it slightly, so if you could repeat it, that would be marvellous.
Okay. In line with the existing legislation, the bill states that the court must make clear what difference an aggravation is made to the sentence imposed. Now, Lord Bracadale recommended removing that requirement, and my question was, is the retention of the requirement helpful, perhaps with regard to transparency in sentencing?
Yeah, I would add that the retention of that instance is essentially very necessary in that regard, because as Jennifer pointed out, it's essential in order to understand that race is something that is being taken seriously, and it's something that is covered adequately, and additional provisions are always necessary when it comes to dealing with matters of race, and in particular this would provide a lot of clarity clarity and transparency. I can't speak today. A lot of clarity and transparency. That's a really hard word to say together. Clarity and transparency in this regard. Apologies for that. Hope that answers your question.
Yes, indeed. Many thanks. Mr. Boyle, do you have comments on that particular aspect, please?
Just to concur with my colleagues there, and also I heard someone in the previous panel saying how important it is that individuals see themselves within the implementation of this particular piece of hate crime legislation. So for those reasons, yes, we would support the retention of that particular aspect.
Okay, many thanks indeed. Thanks, panel. That's me. Thank you, convener.
Thank you very much, John. Now, Fulton McGregor, and then after Fulton, Annabel Ewing have questions about hate crime characteristics, and I'm going to start with Fulton, please.
Thanks, convener. Good morning, panel. I suppose that my question is quite a general one, and I want to ask the panel members if you have any concerns about the way in which the various hate crime characteristics are defined in the bill, and are there any other characteristics you think should be added? And if I could come firstly to Jennifer and then Amy, and then I'll come back to yourself, Danny, because I've got a wee additional question for yourself as well. Thanks.
I guess it's quite a predictable answer, but I can only really comment on the race provisions. And again, we are happy with how race is presented within the bill. I can't really comment on other characteristics, and there are no other ones that I can think of that we would want added.
No, that's okay, and it's useful to get that on the record. Amy, are you able to comment on this question?
So in regards to, I think it's quite interesting in terms of how age is understood in this regard, and I think that particularly a lot of the kind of understanding around that is that it's that the only kind of vulnerable groups or kind of that need to be protected usually is older age groups, and I think that if age is to be understood fully in this regard, it needs to be understood in perspective of young people as well, because a lot of young people do not know their rights, and it's very difficult for them to have the confidence to report or feel supported when doing so. So I think if in regards to that aspect of it, if that is going to be something that is covered and added in the aspect of the bill, then both perspectives of older age and of younger people need to kind of be considered in that regard.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. We heard something similar in our previous panel as well in relation to young people. Danny, if I could ask the same question of yourself, but also wanted to give you the opportunity to put on record that your own Beamis's views on whether we think sectarianism should have been specifically addressed in this bill. Obviously, it hasn't been, but if you think that it should have been defined, or if you feel that the statutory aggravation relating to sectarianism or a standalone offence have been created and added. This is a question that I was asking panel members last week. I don't know if you were following at that point, Danny, but I thought you would maybe want that opportunity to reflect on sectarianism.
Thanks very much, Fulton. I've nothing to add to what my previous colleagues outlined about the first part of your question. The issue of sectarianism, our position is that people who are most likely to be victims of what we understand to be primarily in Scotland the traditional issue of intra-Christian sectarianism, although that's evolving continuously. But going by the stats we have available, the community most likely to be targeted, and we obviously have this link between ethno and religious identities, would be the Catholic community by far and away every year since devolution. There's issue of anti-Protestant issues, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism. If we use the Catholic example, we have I think we put it in our written submission, there's obviously a close link between the Irish, multi-generational Irish community and the Catholic community, and we know from case law, which has been progressed already with regards to, so take for example the case of Walls against Procurator Fiscal, which reflected the issue of the famine is over, why don't you go home, alongside the slaughter calling someone a Fenian bee was successfully prosecuted as both a religious and racial aggravation. So we see no need to create a sectarianism aggravation because the pre-existing statutory aggravations cover the dynamics at play, give us a clearer sight of what's actually going on. And we're a membership organisation at BMIS, and we have members from all of these communities, and we've heard absolutely zero appetite for the need for a sectarianism aggravation. So that's the long and short answer.
Okay, I think that, as I say, it was helpful to give you the chance to put it on the record. That's me, convener. Happy with that. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Fulton. And Annabel Ewing will be next. Then after Annabel, it'll be James Kelly to wrap up this panel. Thank you so much, Annabel.
Thank you, convener. Good morning to our panel. I had a question, perhaps directed to Danny Boyle, given the breadth of background of his organisation that he's representing today. And it was on the issue of the non-inclusion thus far of sex, the characteristic of sex in the bill. And I just wondered if Danny had any particular comments to make on behalf of BMIS on that issue. Thank you.
Thanks, Annabel. I can only respond to it in the context of the intersection between race and sex, and we see from a number of examples of individual cases we're aware of that there's a misogynistic element which links also to the racial aggravation. Where that sits at the moment, obviously, is we have the misogynistic working group on that nature of that hate crime, and we would agree with previous panellists that the work of that group should continue, but also, with that there should be obviously clear parliamentary oversight and participation within that, and that a human rights-based approach would ensure that women's groups were front and centre of being part of that debate and discussion in society more broadly. Our ask would be to ensure that women from BME communities protected on the basis of their colour and their nationality and their ethnic national origin are part of that conversation as well.
Okay, thank you. And just to clarify then, I mean, some people have suggested that, the fact that whatever is going to happen on any potential standalone offence on misogynist harassment down the line, it would have to be said as well, in terms of time, that therefore the lack of inclusion of the characteristic of sex at this time may risk sending a rather odd signal to the public at large. Response to that concern that has been raised?
Sorry, the part of I just missed the end part of your questions. It cut out slightly. Could you just repeat it?
Oh, sorry. So it was basically, some have raised concerns that the lack of inclusion at this time may risk sending a rather odd signal to members of the public at large. And I just wonder if you, Danny, had any particular response to that in light of your previous comment on this issue.
Yeah, to be honest, it would be something we'd need to go back and consult with our own membership on before I could put forward a definitive position on that at the moment.
Okay, thanks for that, Danny, and that's me, convener. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Annabel. That was quicker than I had anticipated. You caught me unawares there. So we'll move directly to James Kelly, please. And I think these will be the last questions for this panel. James.
Thanks, convener, and good morning, panel. I want to concentrate on the issues of support for victims of hate crime. And if I can start with Jennifer, first of all, just ask, are there any additional measures, thinking in terms of education or reporting, that you think could be taken in terms of providing more support to victims of hate crime?
Hi, thank you for that question. There are quite a few other kind of additional measures that could be undertaken. So we've called previously for advocacy groups to kind of form to support victims throughout the reporting process, but all the way through to prosecution. And actually, this kind of ties into a bit about underreporting. So in our submission, we advocated for there to be a duty for ministers to promote reporting of hate crimes. So this is similar to the Social Security Scotland Act, where it was promoting social security take-up. and that could include the formulation of strategies in which they would address any areas that needed improvement within the hate crime reporting system, which again would include support.
Okay, thanks for that, Jennifer. Sorry, Jennifer.
Oh no, yeah. So just yeah, nothing else to add. Sorry.
Thanks a lot. Amy, any comments in this area?
Yeah, that segues quite nicely onto actually what I was hopefully about to bring up in a second. So it kind of speaks really to the need for alternatives to the system, because there isn't adequate support for victims of hate crimes at all, particularly when it comes to racial hate crimes, because a lot of the community really does not trust in the criminal justice system. So they don't want to be involved in it in the first instance, and then when they are looking to continue on that process, if they do choose to report and follow it through, a lot of the times it's just a very uncomfortable and very untrusting process that they really don't want to be involved in. So we think the ways to support victims better would be to have kind of a community support and engagement network that acts as like a consultation space. So people would go and seek guidance and support when they'd experienced a racist hate crime or incident. And from that consultation, they would get the help to determine what the further support that they would want in that instance. So it would run primarily on restorative justice as the main approach. And it would run an education centre, and that would be educating the perpetrator on the harm that the hate crime has done, and kind of look to continue that education along the way, and then do some peer education for people that had done the offence for other people, if kind of restorative justice with the victim isn't kind of working. And there also needs to be like a helpline that allows people to be able to call in kind of with any concerns. And one of the main problems that kind of I think why race needs to be separate, and kind of summarising all of the points that have been discussed, is that currently who is in charge of determining what an instance is, if it is a racist hate crime, is that we really think that it needs to be people from the communities that determine if it is a hate crime in itself. And I think people are the only people that are able to determine that is people with lived experience. I don't think it's adequate for us to allow or think that people with no lived experiences in any to do with racism have the adequate training or understanding or knowledge to be able to adequately understand the impact of that hate crime, the trauma and the racial trauma, and be able to determine if what was said is actually impactful enough, and particularly that happens a lot with microaggressions. So I think there really needs to be a considerable, significant amount of steps in order to support victims better, and that looks like, from our perspective, a complete restructuring of how hate crimes are dealt with. So that's everything I have to add.
Thanks a lot, Amy, for laying out those steps. I think particularly a community support network is really vital to build trust and confidence for victims. Danny, your thoughts in this area?
Thanks, James. Yeah, just to largely reiterate and add one extra thing. We've done conferences for the last number of years on tackling prejudice motivated by racial and religious hatred, and absolutely the remedy of last resort of the law is incredibly important, but it is also about advocacy groups, as Dr. Galbraith mentioned, education, restorative justice. But we miss something as well. I spoke earlier about this ongoing conversation, which Amy and from Intercultural Youth Scotland and some other brave young people who have experienced the sharp end of the wedge in terms of racism within our schools are conducting, a dialogue across institutions, duty bearers and society more broadly about that issue, that impact that the International Human Rights Committee has also picked up about colonialism and imperialism and the impact on young people. But we, as adults, as political parties, as the Scottish Government, as society more broadly, also have a responsibility to take this discussion on. So we have a national performance framework outcome in the Scottish Government to create an inclusive national identity. But what does that actually mean in terms of attending to all of these issues? There was a really interesting observation made earlier. I think Lorna Mackay in the first panel discussion asked why the stirring up a racial hatred defence hasn't been seemed to be used as much within Scotland as it has in other parts of the UK. There's 3 very quick observations I'd give on that. Given it legislation, we may find that, say, for example, groups like the National Front or the BNP, who have a foothold across the UK, will be prosecuted in England or Wales, even though some of their activity might be taking place in Scotland. The other thing we're aware of is that in Scotland there seems to be more of a prevalence of a use of counter-terrorism legislation to tackle some of this. So one of the most recent groups we saw manifesting Generation Identity off the back of National Action, that they were targeted using that. But we've also not quite got to the place in Scotland of really discussing Scottish far-right activism. We're good at identifying where it's manifesting in England. We're not so good at identifying the Scottish-specific trends of it. So we know all these UK groups, Combat 18, National Front, BNP, SDL is Scottish-specific. But there are other examples of where the far-right coalesce in Scotland, where Scotland's not quite at the position yet of having a grown-up conversation about where that's taking place and why it's taking place. So all of these points, James, that colleagues have raised and that we've reinforced are incredibly important, but it's high time Scottish society figures out for itself what we actually mean by an inclusive national identity, and we start to identify far-right organisations in Scotland and what they're orbiting roundabouts. Not always football, actually, at least of it. Some of the best, most anti-racist actions are being taken by football clubs, and it's actually occurring in different dynamics of society, be that marching band culture or whatever it may be, and we're not quite there about having that discussion, and as such, these issues continue to manifest. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks a lot, Danny. Those are points well made. I'll hand back to you, Convener.
Thank you very much. And can I thank Danny, Amy and Jennifer for their evidence this morning. You've very much helped put the specifics of this bill in a much broader context, which raises a whole host of questions, not only for the committee, but for Parliament and Scottish society generally. And we're very grateful to you all for that. As before, we are going to suspend for 5 minutes just to enable a changeover of witnesses, and so we will reconvene at 11:38. Thank you very much. Welcome back, everybody, and I welcome our third and final panel today. We have with us now Claire Graham from DSD Families, Paul Dutton from the Klinefelter Syndrome Association, Lucy Hunter-Blackburn from Murray Blackburn Mackenzie, and Becky Kaufman from the Scottish Trans Alliance. And I'd like to welcome all four of our witnesses to the Justice Committee's meeting this morning to help us continue our consideration of the hate crime and public order bill. And I'd like to open the questioning, if I may, by asking our witnesses to reflect on the amendments that the Cabinet Secretary for Justice has already proposed to his bill. I'll start with Lucy Hunter-Blackburn, if I may, and ask Lucy first and then the other witnesses in turn what their views are of the Cabinet Secretary's proposed amendments. Are they necessary? Are they sufficient? Do they go too far? Or do they indeed not go far enough in terms of the direction of travel? So if I can start with Lucy Hunter-Blackburn and then I'll turn to the other witnesses in turn. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener, and thank you very much for inviting us to give evidence today. There's only one amendment that I understand that's absolutely clear that's been proposed by the Scottish Government, and that's the removal of likelihood, so that there has to be intent. I know that the Cabinet Secretary has suggested that there may be other areas that will need amending consequent on that. I think he mentioned freedom of expression and reasonableness, but I'm not sure we've seen yet the detail. So I can't comment on those other ones, just on the intent. On intent, yes, it's an improvement. I mean, it would be, we highlighted a concern about likelihood, but as I will say later in my evidence, we have much larger concerns about the long shadow, if you like, that this legislation will cast. And what I would say is that by taking out likelihood, you slightly reduce the long shadow over freedom of speech, which we worry about here, but it still remains. So it's an improvement, and it would be wrong for me not to say that, but it's far from answering all our concerns.
So what, in addition, does the Cabinet Secretary need to do, in your view?
Well, if I get the chance right up front here to say where we start from, I would say that the issues all mainly for us are around Part 2. I'll be absolutely clear here. And it's about the extent to which you extend stirring up. We are very concerned that the extension of stirring up is underscoped. There is too much work still to be done to make that work safely around freedom of expression. We are comfortable. We can see a precedent in England for the extension to religion, belief, and sexual orientation. There's a model there that we know hasn't caused trouble for freedom of expression, so something that stays closely to that. But we're very concerned about the extension of stirring up beyond those characteristics at the moment.
Okay, thank you, Lucy. Same question, if I may, to Becky Kaufman, please.
We broadly support the Cabinet Secretary's proposed amendment to intent only. We feel fairly comfortable that the ability to prosecute something based on the on evidence that a person intended to stir up hatred or intended to be threatening or abusive is an appropriate and useful threshold, and we feel that that is an appropriate protection for freedom of expression.
Thank you, Becky. That's very clear. And then a second question to Claire, and then after Claire to Paul, please. Claire.
We think that the change to include intent is important, but I think we have reservations about who defines what is hateful in general for people who are intersex, and the impact that will have on freedom of expression for us to talk about ourselves, but also for us to help to educate people. And sorry, I can't remember what I was going to say about that. So really the issue for us is freedom of speech and how that will affect education regarding differences in sex development.
Okay, thank you. I know other members will want to pick up what you mean by the issue being freedom of speech. We'll come to that in due course. But before we do that, if I may, the same question to Paul Dutton, please.
Hello. I think we're broadly supportive of the amendment. I think there has to be intent shown as opposed to merely a likelihood. And I think that that's an improvement on the bill. So, no further comment on that.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask Rona Mackay to pick up the questioning from here, and then after Rona, it'll be Liam MacArthur, please. Rona.
Thanks, convener, and good morning, panel. I'd like to ask about, as with the other panels, I'd like to ask about the different approach to race hate crime. The proposals in this bill don't require the intent for stirring up racial hatred, and they do include insult. I wonder if I could just ask you, in relation to your own issues, whether you think that this is how it should be, and do you think it creates a hierarchy of characteristics, and are you happy that race crime is being treated separately in this bill? If I could go to Claire first, please, then Paul, Lucy and Becky. Thanks.
Sorry, I don't really understand the question.
Well, race crime accounts for 2/3 of all hate crime, and it's been treated differently. The proposals in this bill would treat it differently in that it doesn't require intent, and that insulting behaviour may be the basis, maybe the threshold. Do you agree with that? And does it set it apart? You know, setting it apart from the issues that you're concerned with, are you satisfied that that should be the case?
I think for race, that's having just listened to the race panel, I think that they seem to welcome that. That's not really relevant to us, obviously, for intersex. I don't think it would be helpful for that to be extended to us, because I don't think we have an agreement on what is considered insulting.
Sure.
Even within intersex charities themselves.
That's absolutely fine. Paul, do you have a view on it? You don't have to answer. You don't have to have a view, but if you do, just speak up about it.
I have to say, Ronan, my main concern is that IVFC is included. I do understand that if race accounts for 2/3 of the reports, that it probably does require a higher profile. But I'd like to understand that all the other characteristics are then included.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Lucy, please.
Yeah, we were, I think we said in our submission, and we've certainly said since, that we see exactly why race is separately treated. It has a much longer history here as a protected characteristic. The origins of that, the panel before you set out in detail. I wouldn't be my expertise at all, but you can see why race is treated differently. So from where we're sitting, treating race separately, which would include only, deciding to stay where we are and only have stirring up offences for race and nothing else, would seem to us justifiable on just by the scale and history and political circumstances around racial hatred.
Okay, thanks, Lucy. Becky?
Well, while we broadly support the concept of a consolidated hate crime bill and feel that that's the most effective improvement to the law, we recognize that historically marginalized groups are not homogenous, and the experiences of hate crime within those groups can vary from group to group. And as was far more eloquently put forth by the race organization, the current structure around race seems appropriate. But we similarly think that the proposed stirring up offenses as they apply specifically to LGBT and including trans identities, is appropriate for our needs as a community. And we don't see anything particularly problematic in the fact that they're different. we're quite strong in our belief that we would not want to see anything in this law that would either be an actual or a perceived rolling back of protections that any community might have had in the past. That's a particular because public confidence in hate crime legislation is particularly problematic. It's really important that this legislation not give the impression that any sort of previously existing protections are being taken away.
That's fine. Thanks very much. That's helpful, Becky. That's me, convener. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rona. I think Liam McArthur and Shona Robertson have some follow-up questions about aspects of the bill that we're talking about at the moment. And if I can come to Liam first and then Shona, please.
Thanks, convener. Good morning to the panel. I think Shona's going to touch on some of the points around freedom of expression, but I maybe want to ask Lucy about the concerns. She was talking about broader concerns in relation to Part 2. Obviously, the changes in relation to intent allay some of the concerns, but I think you're on record as suggesting that the provisions as a whole are not necessary, and that in a sense the approach that's been taken through the legislation recently adopted in England and Wales might provide more of a blueprint that provide the protections that Becky and others have referred to, but do so in a way that perhaps impinge less in relation to the freedom of expression. Lucy.
Thank you. Yes. So the fundamental principle here that we think needs to be looked at is, if I can quote Lord Brackadale, he said, in most cases it's likely to be quite obvious that the conduct is stirring up hatred of a group rather than contributing to meaningful public debate. Now, we think that starting point, that there's a consensus around what is hateful, is very important. If you're going to legislate for stirring up hate, you really have to have a social consensus about what is and is not hateful. And that has come up in some of the earlier discussion today. We would suggest that certainly on some of the extended characteristics, and I know today's panel, transgender identity is the one that we've been asked to talk about. It's very far from clear that there's anything like a public consensus on that, and that's very, very problematic to legislate, therefore, around stirring up hate in that context. And I can talk later, I won't now, about our own experiences there. So it seems to us that if you're going to legislate, the reason to look at what's being done south of the border is you have a model there where you can see legislation has been done and taken forward with protections which have managed to form a reasonably consensual picture in the way it's framed. But as soon as you start doing new legislation here, you're into a very new ballgame about how solid the consensus is around what it is you're actually trying to do. And some of your earlier witnesses talked a lot about relying on the training of the police, the training of prosecutors. There's no democratic exercise over, Parliament needs to know what exactly it thinks people should not be able to say, what counts as stirring up. And I think if you start relying too much on extra legal stuff like training, you move out of that world. You need to be very clear, and the English legislation does actually try quite hard to be very clear about what and is not is, and is inside and outside what counts as stirring up hate. So does that answer the question?
It does, although it maybe raises another question that we've heard from a number of witnesses, not just on this issue, but more broadly about the difficulties that can arise when you start to try and itemise what it is that you're either trying to protect or trying to discourage or even criminalise. So I suppose the question would be, in the absence of that social consensus, how do you, of what is hateful, how do you try and grab a hold of it so that in a legislative sense you have something that's clear to the public, clear to police, to prosecutors, and everybody that's going to be touched by this legislation?
I would strongly suggest that in the absence of that social consensus you don't legislate, because you can't compensate for the absence of the consensus. If you can't
on Lucy, can I just ask a follow-up question on that? Because I'm really interested by this idea that there needs to be social consensus on a matter such as this before Parliament legislates. I mean, stirring up racial hatred was first put on the statute book in the 1960s. And the offences that we currently have in the 1986 Public Order Act are consolidation offences from legislation that was passed in the 1960s. Do we really think that there was social consensus in the 1960s about race relations? Or do we not think rather that what Parliament was, I would say, perfectly appropriately trying to do was to reshape society so that there could become consensus rather than responding to a consensus which previously existed? What do you think about that, Lucy?
No, I think that's a fair point, that there are points where the political world leads, and I wouldn't dispute that. But it depends what's the nature of the fractured consensus. Around transgender identity, particularly, if you look at the sorts of things that are being raised as being hateful, as being transphobic, they are things which are the use of the word, how we use the word woman, how we use the word man, whether you can talk about whether people can change sex. They are very fundamental points. The nature of the dispute around those elements, at least, seems to be quite different from the nature of the dispute you might have seen, or the argument about race in the 1960s. The kind of things which I have positioned as hateful statements in the debate about sex and gender identity are very different in their nature. The nature of it's an argument really about how can we describe what's real, underpins an awful lot of that debate, and the examples and our experiences are very much that. For example, the accusations by MSPs that other MSPs have used the Parliament as a platform for transphobic hatred are about people coming in to talk about women as a sex class in terms of sex-based rights. So these are very different sorts of lack of consensus. I suppose a lack of consensus can operate in different ways. And the sort of tensions around the speech about race in the 60s and 70s is different from the tension that I'm observing now, particularly around transgender identity. And I think that's an important point. So yes, I would concede absolutely. I'm not saying that there's no role for politics in giving a lead. I wouldn't want to give that impression.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, Liam, I cut across your questions there.
That's your prerogative, convener. I just wonder on the back of that, it'd be helpful maybe to hear from other witnesses. Becky, maybe in the first instance, and if other witnesses want to respond as well, please let us know.
I think it's really important that we focus the conversation here on the fact that we are talking about a piece of legislation that talks about the tiny subset of behavior that elevates to being what is criminal. And I think that we've often shifted this conversation to broader philosophical conversations about how different groups feel about the existence of other groups. And there's been robust political debate for years and years about the roles that different groups play in society. And we would never, ever support any sort of legislation that would put any damper on those discussions. What we're specifically talking about here in this bill is behavior that clearly elevates to the level of generating hatred or encouraging others to bring threat or abuse to other people. Now, those are widely accepted principles. The Royal Society down in England and Wales is actually currently reviewing the current legislation down there to make sure that, and one of the principles they're looking at is to make sure that it sufficiently captures threatening and abusive behavior to different groups. And we submitted supplementary evidence in which we suggested that a broad-based approach to reassuring the public, and let's be very clear that parts in the bill that are stating protections about protecting freedom of expression are very important for the purpose of reassuring the public. But the actual legal thresholds are established in other parts of the bill, and those thresholds are rightfully very, very high. And for behavior to actually be criminal, one would have to cross those thresholds. And while I have personally been subject to a fair bit of debate that makes me extremely uncomfortable, that is often very disrespectful of my identity, and yet I would not encourage that to be criminal. What we would like to see, and what we believe that the current structure with the amendment to intent that has been proposed by the Cabinet Secretary, it captures that behavior motivated by prejudice that elevates to the level of threatening and abusive. And that's where we think the law belongs.
That's very helpful, Becky. Thank you for that. Could I ask Paul first and then Claire to respond? Paul.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all understand as a society that there are some limitations to our freedom of expression. And certainly the law in England and Wales is very much predicated on what the person in the street would think. So there's a lot of reference in that legislation to a reasonable person. And I think a reasonable person would see that humiliation, ridicule, bullying, prejudice are all things that are effectively hateful. And I'm not sort of advocating necessarily for prosecution, but we need a way as a society to re-educate people that these behaviours are unacceptable. And I think protecting people in law is a first step to that particular aim. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Finally, Claire, you wanted to come in here.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back to the comparison with race in the 1960s. I think while we might not have understood what racial hate crime was, we understood what we meant by race, different races. We don't, with intersex, we have no clear understanding of what we mean when we talk about that. For example, on the Scottish Government's Equality Unit website, it describes intersex as being male, female, in between, or neither. There are intersex people who would find that offensive. Until the government have a real solid understanding of what intersex is, then I don't think there can be an understanding of what hate crime towards intersex people might look like, or insulting behaviour might look like. And I'm worried that the bill so far and the people that have been spoken to haven't addressed this, and there's no clear definition.
Thanks, that's very helpful, Claire. No further questions, Convener. Thanks.
Thank you, Liam. Shona, would you like to pick up this line of questioning? Thank you.
Panel. I just want to focus on the element within the bill, the general defence of reasonable behaviour, along with the protection for freedom of expression in relation to specific issues. There's been a lot of evidence received by the committee that those provisions need to be strengthened, and I want to seek the panel's views on that. I wonder if I could come to Lucy first, please.
We have a great deal to say on the reasonableness defence. I think we commented on our evidence that for an ordinary member of the public reading it, it's not necessarily very straightforwardly worded, but I don't have a great deal to say about that. On the freedom of expression side, absolutely, I would say that the model in England where everything except race, and this was what I think Lord Brackadale argued to you, everything you include in Section 2 should be covered freedom of expression. That's new compared to where we are now. I think people touched earlier on the tension between having provisions on the face of the law, as they do in England, which set out in detail what is not covered, versus generic ones. I think generic ones are really hard here, frame in a way that give people immediate comfort, something that they can point to and say, this thing I said is not hateful. Again, I would like to come back at some point and explain why in particular contexts that matters so much at the moment. But I mean, the strengthening of freedom of expression protections clearly should be part of, compared to the bill as introduced, clearly should be part of any improvement process. I would agree.
Okay. Does anyone else on the panel want to contribute? Yeah, so Claire and then Becky. Claire, you're muted.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Again, with reasonable behaviour, I would come back to the fact that variations of sex characteristics are so badly understood. And I think oftentimes people might say things just because they don't know. And how do we judge what is reasonable? And again, who decides what is offensive? I think we would quite like for people to be able to talk about variations of sex characteristics, and for if they have misconceptions, that we would be able to help to educate people. I'm not sure how the reasonable person on the street, because it's such a complex issue, would be able to judge that.
I mean, it is a term used in other areas of the law, obviously. Just understanding what you're saying, Claire, you're saying because of the complexity here that might be challenging. Is that my understanding?
Yeah,
you right?
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. I think it's because there is so little information out there, and it's such a badly understood demographic. I don't know what reasonable behaviour or what a reasonable person would be expected to understand.
Okay, Becky, then Paul.
Thank you. I think that oftentimes when we go off into these the discussions of the philosophical nuances of these things, we lose sight of the fundamental reason why we have hate crime legislation. It's not about making sure that somebody meets a standard to fit into a category of victim. It's about categorizing the sorts of prejudice that motivate people who commit these kinds of crimes. And it's important that our understanding is framed in such a way that we don't create unnecessary loopholes. In terms of the reasonableness defense, that's a fairly well-established principle in law across the board that basically is a requirement for the proof of intent. If a reasonable person would not have intended to stir up hatred or to motivate others to create threatening or abusive behavior, then it wouldn't meet the threshold for proving intent, and therefore wouldn't be criminal under this act. And it seems to me that the reasonableness defense is a very integral part of how we would approach and how a prosecutor would approach prosecuting intent.
Thanks, Becky. That's very clear. Thank you. Paul?
I think that a reasonable person does not need a huge knowledge of intersex or VSC. And we know that ignorance of the law is not a defence generally in prosecuted cases. But the reasonable person should know that their behaviour in society has to meet certain standards. And although the information on intersex and VSC is not necessarily in the public domain, standards of behaviour of people are in the public domain. And they should know. I, as a reasonable person, must know how to treat other people. And I must know what standards of behaviour are unacceptable. So if I set out to bully or humiliate somebody, or simply ridicule them because of what they look like, because they don't meet my standard of male or female, then surely that is not the behaviour of a reasonable person.
Okay, thank you. I think Claire wanted to come back in.
Yeah, I don't disagree with what Paul said there. What concerns me is that within intersex groups, there isn't even consensus on how we talk about ourselves. So, for example, there are some intersex people who would I remember reading an article once that described us as queer bodies, which I find offensive as a label for me. But then the way that I talk about myself as having a medical condition, other people with variation sexual characteristics don't like. If we can't agree as a group, as the group that's been talked about, what is meant by unreasonable or reasonable, how is that going to be interpreted by other people?
Okay, that's helpful. I can see. Can I bring I think Paul and Lucy just very briefly? I'm conscious of time. Paul, did you have something you wanted to come back, and then briefly, Lucy?
Only very briefly, that KSA works and collaborates with a vast number of IVSC organisations. And there are many, as Claire says, where people only talk about their condition by name. Some will call it intersex and some will call it a variation of sex characteristics. But, you know, I think generally we can't list 40-odd different conditions in legislation. What we need is an umbrella term. And a lot of us shy away from the term DSD because medics in particular interpret it, as was put out in Chicago in 2006, as a disorder of sex development. And a lot of us are not happy with that and have come to the conclusion that IVSC is a better umbrella term than anything else that exists. So I really just want to say that, you know, I do understand why we can't list every single thing that we may have, but we need an umbrella term that can try to cover everybody. Thank you.
And finally, Lucy, briefly.
Okay, thank you. So it's important here when we're talking about reasonableness to remember we're talking about the reasonableness of the content of your speech, not the reasonableness of, say, how your behaviour in a more general sense, because we're in part 2 of the bill at this point. And I wanted to come back to this idea about intent. I think I could say things with intent, which I just meant to be communicating a message that I regarded as okay, and other people would say that the message, the content of what I was saying was hateful. In fact, I know this because it's happening to me at the moment. So I think the problem with the reasonableness defence, the limitation of it is if you don't agree on what is a hateful, when a statement stirs up hate, you have a fundamental problem. Your chain of thought breaks because reasonably, you could say this reasonable person looks at me and says, well, she certainly intended to say that, and she certainly intended people to take that message from her. But whether or not that message counts as stirring up hate then becomes utterly crucial as to how helpful that defence of reasonableness is. I hope that's helpful.
Yes, thank you, Lucy. That's all from me, convener.
Thank you very much, Shona. I mean, I just wanted to pick up a little bit on what Lucy just said there at the end. I mean, I think it is important that we bear in mind that reasonableness in the relevant provisions of this bill does not speak to offensiveness. One of the very first questions that the committee put to the Cabinet Secretary right at the beginning of its inquiry was whether the Cabinet Secretary accepted that the right to freedom of expression includes the right to express yourself offensively. And he very clearly said that he does accept that. We're not talking here about, Becky made this point earlier in this session. We're not talking here about expressing yourself offensively. It's very clear that we understand that. We're talking here about expressing yourself or behaving in a manner that is threatening or abusive. And reasonableness goes to whether the behaviour is threatening or abusive or not. So that's the level of criminality. And I hope here that I'm simply underscoring what I think Becky has already said in her evidence this morning. But if I have misrepresented it, then please correct me, Becky. But with that slight caveat in mind, perhaps I can invite Liam Kerr to wrap up this aspect of the questioning before we move on to John Finney. Liam.
Thanks, convener. I just have one question which I'll direct specifically to Lucy Hunter-Blackburn, unless anyone else wants to come in with her response. And I direct it based on what we've just been talking about. So, Lucy, I understand you write stuff, you publish stuff, you research. And the question I posed in panel 1 was that several people have expressed concerns that the stirring up offences could be used to label something as hate speech, and that even if that doesn't lead to prosecution, the threat of the investigation, the threat of the court action, could lead the writer to self-censor. Now, you mentioned in passing a couple of times there about your own experiences. I don't know if this directly relates to it, but do you think that is a danger on the current drafting of Part 2? If so, what can be done? Are the thresholds that are in there high enough to prevent these adverse effects?
To that question, I think it is very important to distinguish between the thresholds which are likely to trigger a successful prosecution or even an attempted prosecution and the wider effects of the bill. And I'd want to very much reinforce the evidence that you got from John McClellan about what he called chilling effects of the law here, that it's not just about, when you legislate here, you aren't just legislating for the very small number of people. And I would agree absolutely with Becky, the people who are likely to actually be prosecuted successfully under this will have met very high thresholds. I don't disagree with that. It's the long shadow that this law is going to cast as people worry about investigation. John was very eloquent on how the fear of investigation, even just the fact of being contacted by the police, so if you are brought in at that level, even if the charges are not pursued or they're dropped before they come to court, after you've been investigated, the fact of being investigated in the first place, and then even the fear of an investigation. And I think I mentioned our experience. So the University Press, we put forward an article which was a discussion of the way policy had been formed around transgender and women's rights in prisons and the census. And when it got nearly to the point of publication, I'm sorry if I can find it, the internal memo at the EUP described our article. It expresses anti-trans sentiment and uses terms that are discriminatory and insulting towards trans women. For example, the use of women, specifically excluding trans women. It would be morally wrong and socially irresponsible. This was like anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Now, in that context, it was dealt with as a sort of internal publishing issue, and we were published. I'm absolutely sure if this bill existed, it's very likely that the publisher would have had trailed in front of them the potential for a stirring up offence being committed by the publisher. And I think publishers will worry about that, and I know writers will. And I do think very strongly that John's points need to be taken very seriously, that it's not just about how hard it is to get a prosecution, and your thresholds in the law might be high enough for that. But the wider fight, the side effects on behaviour are very, very important here. And I noticed, for example, Michael Clanchley, when he was speaking to you, said about the dwelling defence, he talked about there being no sanctuary for hate speech. He used the term hate speech. Now, that struck me as interesting because the law here is not looking at hate speech, but stirring up hate, which is distinctive and different. So even in the context of discussing the bill in this committee with someone from the Law Society, you're beginning to see a shading of the way in which what's legally proposed is discussed. And I do think the reliance on training or guidance of prosecutors or police officers is not a strong protection for people in my situation and others who might be worried about being caught up in the wider shadow, the bigger shadow this law casts. And the same point's been made by Callum Steele, by some of the other witnesses on your religious belief faith panel made these points too, and I would want to echo them. I think other examples from academia, we put in our evidence stickers at Edinburgh University which had adult, it just said woman, noun, adult, human, female. And these stickers were referred to police as Scottish Trans Alliance, suggested people might want to refer them to the police. The university referred them to the police as potential hate incidents. So I do think it's, the level at which hate is perceived and the stirring up of hate, theoretically, in that case, it can't be, I think we need to be very careful to understand quite how widely that net is being cast as hate, not just as offence, but quite specifically as hate. I hope that's enough. I'm conscious of your time.
I'm very grateful, and I know that Becky would like to come in response to that, so perhaps I can hand to Becky.
I think we have to realize that the premise of this question presumes the existence of a power relationship within hate crime law that just doesn't exist. And that the power relationship across hate crime law exists with the police and prosecutors, not with the victims. And just because a victim feels offended by something does not mean that something is going to be prosecuted. In my firsthand experience, I cannot name a person who was victim of things that definitely crossed thresholds that should have been considered hate crimes under the existing legislation, who felt that the police over-investigated. I've got lots of examples of people who feel that the police under-investigated. The particularly important thing here is to talk about the reality of how hate crime works in practice. We have very clear statistics that show that hate crime is massively underreported. Hate crime law doesn't capture the majority of hate behavior. And this new law isn't likely to capture that much more behavior than the old laws have. And creating this theoretical boogeyman that standing up for historically marginalized communities in the law is somehow or another going to undermine a fairly robust tradition of freedom of speech and freedom of expression in this country, I find downright absurd. The actual practical reality is that people don't report hate crimes. The actual practical reality is that hate crime legislation doesn't protect people from really, really distressing, really, really harmful behavior. Thank you.
Very grateful. Thank you. No further questions, convener.
I just want to, again, I'm sorry, Lucy, if you think I'm picking on you, but I just want to press a little what you said in response to Liam Kerr, if I may, because I think this conversation between you and Becky goes right to the heart, right to the very heart of the concerns and controversies that there are around this bill. Lucy, I think I heard you say that if you had submitted your article to Edinburgh University Press after this bill had come into force, that you think that the article would not have been published. So, how is that? If that's right, if I've heard and understood you correctly, how is that anything other than a completely unreasonable interpretation and application of what this bill actually says? Because what this bill seeks to criminalise, as I've already tried to emphasise in my questions today, is behaviour that is threatening or abusive. So how is it even in the ballpark of reasonableness to argue that submitting an academic article to a journal published by Edinburgh University Press, which describes women in a certain way, meets that threshold of criminality?
But I don't think the way that these things operate is constrained by people making very careful decisions about what's going to happen down the line in a court case, in a prosecution case. As John McLevin, I think, argued very strongly, and from his own experience in the world of journalism, it's the fear of the fear of a criminal prosecution, and the fear people will go a long way back to avoid the risk of ending up caught up in any kind of police investigation or any other kind of or with the authorities. I mean, that's where the worry lies with this bill. It's not about who's going to end up being prosecuted. It's about how to be interpreted. I think the caution in publishers. I mean, the publisher went to the lawyers to get a view as to whether our article contravened university policy, despite the fact that the only fact that they had about it was our use of the word woman. I mean, people are very, very cautious, and that's just in the context of breaching university policy. Once you bring the criminal law in, they will become far more cautious again. And I noticed that both Colin McFarlane and Tim both said, they would expect it was normal for new law to be tested. It's normal for people to bring forward things to test them. And I think we will see that. We will see people, and nobody wants to be that test case. So I very much appreciate Becky's points. I absolutely accept that in terms of what you might call sort of part one, sort of hate crime, which is directed at people, it will be underreported. But I think once you start getting into the broader concept of stirring up hate, which is a different type of abuse and threat, and what is abusive in that context as well, I think, will all need to be established in law, will have to be precedented, will have none, we don't start from a baseline for the new characteristics of what counts in these contexts. So that's why I raise it, not because I think it would be a reasonable judgment. I wouldn't think it would be a reasonable judgment but I don't think it was a reasonable judgment on the part of Edinburgh University to refer the stickers to the police that said adult human female, but that was a process that the SDA themselves encouraged. So, what the levels here, there is not a strong consensus about where the lines draw, about what is reasonable to say and how. I do think.
Thank you, Lucy. Paul and Becky want to come in very briefly on this, and then I'm going to hand over to John Finney, who's waiting very patiently. Sorry, John, to delay you, but Paul first, and then Becky, please.
Okay. Just a point really that if it's a measure of our society how we look after minorities, we must really not avoid creating protections just because it makes academic publication difficult. And I do agree, and not just out of concern for my own published work, that academic study does require some protection. But as I say, the protection of minorities is surely a greater thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul and Becky.
And just very briefly, as a clarification of fact on the issue of those stickers, the SDA was neither approached nor did we give any advice to anybody as to whether or not they should be referred to.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. John, you've been very patient. Thank you.
Good, convener, and good afternoon, panel. I want to ask about aggravations. The general approach to dealing with hate crime is the continued use of statutory aggravations as the core method. It's been broadly welcomed. I wonder if any of our panel disagree that should continue. If not, I'll move on to supplementary question. There seems to be consensus around that, as indeed with other witnesses. I wonder if I can touch on the issue that I did with previous panels as a follow-on to this, and perhaps come in the first instance to yourself, Becky Kaufman, because the Trans Alliance are supportive of the development of, quote, a bespoke system of hate crime data collection, and that would facilitate disaggregation across the characteristics covered by this legislation. Could you comment on that aspect, please?
Certainly. As has been brought forward by a number of the race groups earlier this morning, it's very difficult to plan and build broader community programs that encourage community cohesion and ultimately get at the root cause of hate crime without a reasonable picture of where these types of crimes are taking place. And unfortunately, and cognizant of the fact that updating data systems can be incredibly complicated and expensive, we're aware that Police Scotland currently does not have a particularly efficient method of collating, reporting, and then disaggregating data that is useful to Equalities Organization. And ultimately, just based on a lifetime of working in various public bodies, both here and in the United States, I'm aware that sometimes it requires sticking a requirement into a piece of legislation to get the ball pushed in the direction to improve the systems of collecting that data. And it's primarily for that reason, because data is incredibly useful and it's incredibly powerful, and we would like to see an improvement in that data and its availability.
Yeah, thank you for that. Can I ask you, in one of your recent replies, you used the term underreporting. If you've no confidence in the existing system, can you perhaps see how you believe there to be underreporting, please?
Well, effectively, we do a wide range of community engagement and community results. The most recent piece of hate crime research that Equality Network and Scottish Trans Alliance did identified that roughly 74% of LGBT people and 80% of trans people have experienced a hate crime at some time in their lives, and nearly 2/3 of those, that hate crime had happened within a year of our research being conducted. But the most troubling statistic in there is 71% of our respondents that they never reported. They've never gone to the police. And the feedback that I get, and this is a huge part of the community engagement element of my role, is that because historically, and we need to remember that it was less than 30 years ago that the police were in direct opposition with LGBT communities. And painful memories go a long way, and therefore there remains a fundamental need to improve the level of trust within trans communities of the system. There's often a presumption that many of us who have the privilege of being more middle class and coming from a more established societies have that people wearing uniforms and badges, and that the criminal legal system itself are always the good guys. But that's not always been the case. And we've seen it as recently as within the past year, when this Parliament passed a piece of legislation forgiving the felony convictions of gay men. I mean, the criminal legal system sometimes gets it wrong, and there's a lack of confidence. So there's a lot of underreporting because there remains a lack of confidence.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for that. A question to all the panel. I'm conscious of time. In line with existing legislation, the bill states that the court must make clear what difference an aggravation has made to the sentence imposed. Now, an argument that will lead to increased transparency in sentencing. Can the panel comment on that, please? And maybe first instance to Ms. Graham, please.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah. Sorry. In line with existing legislation, the bill states that the court must make clear what difference an aggravation has made to the sentence imposed. There's a view that can lead to increased transparency in sentencing. Could you comment on that, please?
I don't really have a comment to make on that, to be honest. Our main concern is just how variations in sex characteristics, whether it should be included in this at all, which we don't think it should be.
Okay, thanks very much indeed for that. Then, Mr. Dutton, please.
So, as Becky has partly pointed out, in some cases, because people like me don't exist in the protection legislation at the moment, there are basically no stats on how often we report crimes that relate to ourselves as people. I mean, I have some research from the University of West of England in 2009, which contains a lot of anecdotal evidence of behaviours inflicted on people that might have resulted in court cases under other circumstances. And I think as far as aggravation and transparency in sentencing are concerned, I would like to think that if these things reach into the public domain through the courts, there will be some degree of understanding in the community that these behaviours are unacceptable, and it will have a deterrent effect on that sort of behaviour, and the people will think before they do things in future.
Okay, thank you. I don't know, do either of our other two witnesses wish to comment on that? No. Okay, thank you very much indeed, panel. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much, John. Annabel Ewing is next. Then after Annabel, it'll be Fulton, and after Fulton, it'll be James Kelly, please. Annabel.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning to, good afternoon, rather, to our panel, our last panel of the day. If I could first of all go to Claire, and it's on the issue of the intersex variations in sexual characteristics issue that has been aired a wee bit already this morning. And I just noted in Claire's most recent response that she indicated that she did not think that this terminology should be included in the bill. And just thinking back to the session thus far, it might be helpful if Claire, just for the record, could explain on that specific issue why she feels that that should not be included in the bill. I think that would be helpful. Thank you.
I think there's a few issues with it. First of all, that there is no clear definition of what we mean by variations of sex characteristics, or who would be captured by that. I also think there isn't a strong evidence base that it needs to, I agree that it needs to be taken out from trans in the definition, but there's no evidence base that it needs to be included as a separate characteristic itself. If you look at, I think, Inclusion Equality Network, they did a survey of LGBTI, and it included 17 intersex respondents. Of those, 29% said that they had experienced some form of hate crime, which boils down to 5 people who have said that this is something they would need. And the Equality Network themselves have said there's an issue in that the survey was self-selecting and it was heavy on LGBTI, so not inclusive of maybe people with variations of sex characteristics who don't identify as LGBT. As I say, the biggest issue is that we don't have there is no understanding of what we mean by variations of sex characteristics. It's a very broad and vague term. And I don't think it would necessarily protect the people it's intended to protect. And I think where people with variations of sex characteristics or difference of sex development might experience discrimination, it could be covered by other hate crime legislation. So, for example, if it's someone with a visible difference, that could be covered by disability legislation. It doesn't have to be on its own.
Thank you for that, Claire. What then do you see as the key disadvantage then of including such an approach in the bill? What I mean, on balance, do you think it would cause harm rather than be neutral? Or, because obviously you don't feel it's positive, so what do you see in terms of consequences?
Well, as I said earlier, I think there's an issue with how, even within the intersex community, for want of a better word, there's no consensus ourselves in how it should be spoken about. And I worry that it could end up being policed either way, in a way that it makes it difficult for people who have DSDs, who want to talk about their bodies or medical condition in one way. That could end up being perceived as abusive or hateful by someone else. And so it's gonna make it quite difficult to talk about variations of sex characteristics and to encourage greater public awareness.
Okay, thank you. Do you feel that you've had the opportunity to make your points in terms of any discussions with the Scottish Government? Do you feel that you've had your shot in terms of consultation? And
no, not really. I mean, yes, today, and we're grateful for the opportunity today to speak to you, but I think we were left out of the consultation in the lead up to this. And I think one of the frustrations that charities like ours have is that when we talk to the Scottish Government, intersex is always taken as a political identity, and we're directed towards inclusion, where we feel that where improvements need to be made for people with variations of sex characteristics, it is actually in healthcare and in peer support, psychological support, and none of this will address that for us. And they're the needs that, when you talk to people with DSDs, they're the needs that they will talk about, that they would highlight.
Okay, thank you for that, Claire. I don't see anybody else seeking to come in, and so I'll maybe turn to my other question. But obviously, if anybody wishes to, I do now, Paul. If Paul Dutton, please.
apologies, Annabelle, because I was assuming you would come to me and the rest of the witnesses. So I'm afraid I do disagree with VSD families. I think there is a clear definition of intersex or variations of sex characteristics, and that is given by the United Nations Commissioner for Human Rights. And so it's quite a persuasive definition that covers gonads, genitals, sex chromosomes, body shapes, all the rest of it. So I think there is a clear definition. KSA do collaborate with many other support groups, not DSD families yet, but it can never be ruled out, of course. And there are over 40 different conditions. Our survey with the University of West of England in 2009 covered over 300 people. And we can take from that this is not just a healthcare issue, not just a disability, although those things can apply, but very much a social issue, because we all have to operate within a social world and a social community. So we have suffered discrimination in places such as schools, colleges, scout groups, military, other workplaces. That's not to say that we believe this is a political matter, but of course politics is all about citizens, cities and society. And as a result, I think we operate in those areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. I see that Lucy Hunter-Blackman has put an R in the chat box. Lucy?
Just briefly, I absolutely defer to the other panel members on the particular question of VSCs, DSDs, whatever terminology people prefer. But I think the inclusion of them raises another issue, which is, as there's a clear consensus, the one consensus is that this is a physical, biological state, is why this particular group are included, but not maybe others who would also be vulnerable for particular physical conditions. I was thinking of someone, I have a very good long-term friend with a serious facial injury, and facial injury is impossible to hide. It's a very, I know from spending time with them, it's if you take it out in the street and it attracts attention, not always very welcome attention, to have a serious facial disfigurement of some description. And that group has to shelter under disability. And I suppose really it's what's the evidence base that pulls out particular groups by physical, biological characteristics is mainly, it would be the issue I'd ask the committee maybe to think about in terms of the consistency of the bill in its totality. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that interesting comment. Turning to another issue which I had raised with previous witnesses, and that is the position as the bill currently stands in terms of the fact that the characteristic of sex included as a category of benefiting from particular protection. And I just wonder if there are any views on that, and perhaps I could start with Lucy, because I did read her paper and I know that she made a number of points in her written submission on that. I'm not sure the others did, but they're very welcome to comment if they wish to are in the chat box. Thank you.
Which I thought was very useful. He said it's really important that people can see themselves in this legislation, and obviously a group who can't see themselves in it as it stands are those who are subject to any kind of and I'm thinking Premier Part 1 here, any kind of abusive or harassment behaviour based on their sex. We're not visible, and that is almost entirely women. Largely, we know clearly that we can see in women in public life attracting a great deal more abusive comment, a great deal more based on their sex than men. And Tim also mentioned the targeted Dear Haters campaign, the annual campaign, and women are not visible in that campaign. He mentioned particularly the value of being able to see individual groups discussed, and we mentioned in our evidence that it's becoming more and more apparent, and the more characteristics you add that are covered in the hate crime legislation, the more obvious it is the ones that aren't. and it becomes about what forms of hate are and are not acceptable, what messages you send. And there's a very, I think Brackadale sees this as a largely again stirring up, but he sees a strong symbolic quality to hate crime, and I wouldn't at all dispute that. And women are not anywhere to be seen in the bill as it stands. Now, I do understand, and I've looked at the arguments for those arguing to take it out, which I think seems to be mainly coming from Engender and a small group of organisations that specialise around particularly domestic abuse, sexual violence, and these are important organisations that bring expertise to the table. I won't dispute that, but I don't find their arguments very clear and compelling as to why we shouldn't, as a default, include sex as a characteristics that's covered. By all means, the misogynistic working group could continue. It could do the work that's planned. It will take some time. I mean, all of us who've been involved in policy and law formulation will know that from where we are to law in this area, we could be looking at 2 or 3 years, very, very easy, and change of government and all of that, and things are going to happen. So our strong view would be the default position, unless someone can truly demonstrate very clearly that it would be harmful to include sex, and I haven't seen or heard from any of the earlier witnesses a compelling reason why it would be harmful. We think the strong arguments fall in favour of including sex for now, so that it's included in public information campaigns, so we can gather stats. And as your other witnesses have talked this session and previous ones very eloquently about the importance of statistics, and of course we have none. I wanted to particularly pick up on what's her name, Isabel, from the Muslim Development and Education. She made a point about the intersection between religion and sex, and earlier Danny mentioned between race and sex. And again, if we don't gather, if sex isn't covered, we don't see that. So I'm really keen. I think that the committee should interrogate why the default position is not to start with sex. And by all means, if a working group comes up with a better option that's going to need primary legislation, then at that point you can take sex out. I do, just on the technical point, I think the most compelling reason I saw for their position from Engender and others was the interrelationship between domestic abuse and sexual violence and crimes of sexual violence, and they were worried about the interaction of hate there. In our submission, we suggest, well, there may be ways to deal with that by saying that if you're engaging the domestic abuse aggravator, then you wouldn't use a sex-based one. It would be secondary, that you don't use this as an aggravation in cases of sexual assault and violence, because I do take their argument that choosing between difference of those to say which are hate-based and which are not doesn't look, you could see the argument against going down that route. But it seems to us that all the arguments for not including sex now can be countered reasonably straightforwardly, and the argument that if you leave it out, the signalling of leaving it out now becomes increasingly important. And I think others of your witnesses have mentioned that particularly particularly if you do stirring up and you protect one half of the charge debate and not the other, you have another problem as well. Hope that's helpful.
Okay. Very, very interesting. Thank you, Lucy. I see that we have Paul and then Becky in the chat box. Paul, please. Thank you.
Right, sorry. So I have some sympathy with Lucy over the inclusion of sex there, and people who have bad behaviour around intersex people, particularly my type of person, it's often perceived feminine behaviour in people who largely appear to be male. And I'm sure in the perpetrator's minds there is some issue with sex and what males and females should look like and how they should behave. And I do think there is a broader question to answer on whether there should be some overarching protection over sex itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. And can we go to Becky, please? Thank you.
I raised this point a little bit earlier in my evidence, that while we broadly support the consolidation efforts of this bill and a degree of uniformity to the approach of hate crime, a variety of groups who experience negative societal behavior don't do it uniformly and homogeneously. And I think that contrary to the assertion that Lucy just made, I believe organizations such as Engender, Rape Crisis Scotland, Scottish Women's Aid have actually done many, many years of research, have engaged in this process quite well. And we as an organization are quite aware that we haven't done that research, but that there is an ongoing discussion debate. And I would personally and organizationally, we would like to see that conversation play out, as a fairly large number of women's organizations in this area do have a range of opinions, and ultimately, within the wisdom of this committee or the misogyny working group, we would support any approach that provided increased protection for women in society. Hope that's helpful.
Thanks, Vicky. I guess one issue amongst some others is an issue that has been raised already, which is timing. But that's for our further deliberations, convener. Thank you, and thank you to the witnesses. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annabelle. I know one or two people have indicated that they want to come back in, but I'm going to have to move on to Fulton and James because we're rapidly coming up against 1 o'clock, and some members may have to leave for other engagements at that time. And I want to ensure that, if I may, Lucy, that all members get the chance to answer their questions. To ask their questions. So Fulton and then James, please.
Thanks, convener, and good afternoon, panel. I suppose Annabelle has mainly covered the issues in this line of questioning. I think that most people have a really good chance to answer. So, convener, with your permission, my question is really just a general one, but perhaps it does allow those who wanted to come back in to make a comment as well, if you're okay with that. And basically my question is really just to ask the panel if they have any concerns about the way in which the various hate crime characteristics have been defined, and if there are any other characteristics other than the ones we've already spoken about that we think should be added. And I'll leave your discretion whether you're okay with members who placed an R in the box coming back in.
Let's go to Lucy first then, and then the other witnesses if they want to come in. Lucy.
Well, I think an issue that Andrew Jekyll raised, and we raised too, were about the approach where you just list a handful of characteristics, and that those are the only people who are covered. We raised homeless people, and so did he, about who, as a group, who are often targeted. People from this is one point on where the aggravators are a part one type issue are targeted for violence on the street for being homeless, and there are other groups who are clearly targeted. We mentioned, and I think I'll take this chance I made to draw to the committee's attention, the alternative models that have been used in New Zealand and a couple of other jurisdictions, where you start with a list and then you leave it sort of open-ended and say it's about difference. And because I absolutely would agree, we don't want people being targeted for violence, for abuse in the street, for anything like that, based on just being different from how other people and how they're expected to be. And I think the New Zealand model offers a more open-ended way of thinking about this, and it doesn't tie you into one set of characteristics that you then have to list and who's in and who's out and have the sort of debate that we're having this morning. It leaves it more open-ended. You still have to worry about how you monitor that statistically, I do understand, but I think it's a worthwhile model, and I would very much hope that the committee would have a look at that and scope for that being an alternative to arguing over precisely who is and isn't on a list. I think that's given to time. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Yeah, Claire and then Paul, please.
One of the things that keeps coming up this morning is that people should be able to recognise themselves in this legislation, and I don't think that variation of sex characteristics is not a common term amongst people with difference in sex development. I'm not sure they would recognise themselves within that or within the definition. I also just wanted to quickly just come back and say, Paul mentioned how maybe including sex as a protected characteristic might help to include people with variations of sex characteristics. And I think that's an avenue that's worth exploring, is whether we are protected anyway on the basis of our sex and our differences.
Thank you. And Paul?
I think on that last point, I don't think sex is sufficient to protect us, because sex is usually assumed to be, in most people's mind, typically male or typically female. But I was going to comment on Lucy's point about it's not necessary to have who's in and who's out. I think actually that once you are listed in legislation, first of all, you get statistics based on that, and you also get the statistics based on reports of crime. And you can then also be included in equality legislation, which at the moment is something of a blank for people like us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Fulton, is there anything else you want to cover before we move to James?
No, I'm quite happy to leave it at that, convener, unless anybody else is wanting to come back in.
Thank you very much, Fulton. So, final set of questions then to James Kelly, please.
Thanks, convener. Conscious of time, I'd like to go straight to Claire Graham on support for victims of hate crime. I just wondered, Claire, if you think there are other measures that need to be taken in terms of things like, reporting, education, to give greater support to those who are victims of hate crime.
Well, it's not something at DSD Families that we have much experience of, because it doesn't seem to be something that's commonly reported by the young people and the families that we work with. Extra support for people with variations of such characteristics is always welcome, and there is never enough support, I think, is the only answer I can give to that.
Okay, thanks for that, Claire. Does anybody else want to come in on that? Don't see any indications, convener, so I'll just hand back to you.
Paul wants to come in.
Sorry, Paul, on you go.
Okay, in terms of support for victims, I think it's very important to have psychological support. One of the people I was talking to at the weekend, who was part of that 2009 study concluded that our people experience high levels of emotional distress and reduced psychosocial functioning. That person had cognitive behaviour therapy 35 years after the nightmare they describe at school and in Scouts. And I think really psychological support is understated and underrated in a lot of these circumstances. And I think rather than just thinking of these things as medical or disability issues, we really need to take the social side and the psychological side into account. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Thanks for bringing that practical example to the attention of the committee. Back to you, convener.
Well, thank you very much. And can I thank all four witnesses for sharing their time and experiences. These are matters which obviously affect you all, have affected you all very deeply and personally. And I just thank you really genuinely for the way in which you've helped the committee to understand the human implications of a number of things that we've been trying to talk about over the course of recent weeks. And we need to move on now to the final public item of our business before we join Fraser on Teams in private, which is to consider the Electronic Monitoring Relevant Disposal Scotland Regulation 2020, which is a negative instrument, I think I'm right in saying, in respect of which we wrote to the Scottish Government, and we have seen the answer that we've received from Scottish ministers about the element of this SSI concerning its varies under the Management of Offenders Act that we wanted to take up. Given the answer that we've received from the Cabinet Secretary, Are members content not to make any further comment to Parliament on this SSI, or is it a matter that members want to take forward? Is anybody wanting to say anything about this? Liam MacArthur.
Thanks, Convener. I was busily just trying to type in content as well. I think I'd raised concerns about the challenge, not the principle of the proposal, which I was comfortable with and raised during the passage of the bill itself. But I think in light of the response from the government, I'm happy that that matter has been addressed.
Yeah, thank you. I share that view. I think the committee was right to raise this issue with the Cabinet Secretary, and I'm glad we did. And I think that the answer that we got was very helpful and clarified the matter. No doubt this correspondence that we're referring to will be published on the committee's website if it hasn't already been. Other members are indicating that they are content. That brings the public part of our meeting today to a close. Our next meeting will be a week today on Tuesday, the 24th of November. When we will continue to take evidence on the Hate Crime and Public Order Bill, including again from the Cabinet Secretary for Justice. I now close the public part of this meeting and invite members to continue in private on Microsoft Teams, unless other 1 o'clock commitments are more pressing in their diaries. Thank you very much.